In the summer of 1518, a woman stepped into a street in Strasbourg and began to dance. Within a month, she had killed several people, not with a weapon, but with her feet. Her name was Frau Trophäa, and on a July afternoon thick with heat, she walked into a narrow street near the city centre and started moving. The cobblestones beneath her feet were worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels and foot traffic. Around her, the smells of medieval life hung in the air. Fresh bread from the baker's guild mixing with the sour stench of open sewage channels. Church bells marked the passing hours from towers that pierced the summer sky. Strasbourg was a prosperous city then, a place where merchants traded goods from across Europe, where families had lived in the same houses for generations. At first, people smiled. A woman dancing in the street wasn't scandalous. Perhaps she'd had too much wine, or maybe she was celebrating some private joy. Children stopped to watch. A few adults paused in their errands, curious. She danced without music, her movements neither graceful nor coordinated, just constant. Her arms swung, her feet moved. She spun and swayed as though pulled by invisible strings. Then an hour passed. Then another. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the half-timbered houses in shades of amber and gold. Frau Trophäa was still dancing. The smiles faded from the faces of onlookers. Concern replaced amusement. Someone brought her water, which she drank while still moving her feet. Someone else called for her husband. He came. He pleaded. She danced. Night fell over Strasbourg, and the street emptied as families returned to their homes. In the darkness, lit only by the occasional lamp, she continued. Her breathing grew ragged, sweat soaked through her clothes. Still her body moved, as though it no longer belonged to her, as though some other force had taken control and refused to let go. By morning, blood stained the cobblestones. Her feet had split open, the skin torn away by hours of relentless movement. Yet she danced. People gathered again, no longer amused, now frightened by what they were witnessing. This wasn't celebration. This wasn't madness in any form they recognized. This was something else entirely. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. They appeared in the same street, in nearby squares outside churches. They came alone or in pairs, and once they started, they couldn't stop. Their faces showed exhaustion, pain, confusion, but their bodies kept moving. The city's physicians were summoned. They examined the dancers, consulted their texts, debated amongst themselves. Their conclusions seemed logical for the time. The dancing was caused by hot blood, an imbalance of the body's humors that could only be cured by letting it burn itself out. So the authorities made a decision that, in hindsight, appears almost incomprehensible. They would help the dancers dance. Stages were constructed in public spaces. Professional musicians were hired to provide accompaniment. The reasoning was clear to medieval minds. If the sickness came from too much heat, too much energy in the blood, then the cure was to exhaust it completely. More people joined. By the end of the month, approximately 400 people were dancing through the streets of Strasbourg, and they were dying. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion, their hearts giving out after days without rest. Others suffered strokes. Still others simply danced until their bodies could no longer sustain life. The truly unsettling detail isn't just that this happened. It's that it kept happening. Dancing plagues erupted across medieval Europe for more than 200 years. Aachen in 1374, Cologne in 1418. Different cities, different decades, but always the same pattern. People dancing uncontrollably until they dropped. What force could be powerful enough to override the human body's most basic instinct? Self-preservation. The doctors watched hundreds collapse from exhaustion. They prescribed a cure that seems insane today. Dance harder, faster, longer. To understand why requires stepping fully into the medieval mind, into a world where medicine and magic were not separate disciplines, but intertwined threads of the same tapestry. When physicians arrived in Strasbourg to examine the dancers, they brought with them centuries of accumulated knowledge. Knowledge that, to our modern eyes, appears to have nothing to do with the human body as we understand it. Medieval medicine rested on a foundation laid down by ancient Greek philosophers. The theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These four fluids supposedly flowed through every person's body, and health meant keeping them in perfect balance. Too much of one, too little of another, and disease would follow as inevitably as night follows day. The physicians examining Frau Trophea and the others who joined her dance believed they were witnessing a textbook case of humoral imbalance. Hot blood, they declared. The summer heat had warmed the blood to dangerous temperatures, causing it to rise toward the brain and create an irresistible urge for movement. The diagnosis made perfect sense within their framework. And if the problem was too much hot blood, then the solution was obvious. Help the body expel the excess through vigorous physical activity. Sweat it out. Dance until the balance restored itself. So they built stages. They paid musicians from the city's coffers. They created an infrastructure for organized continuous dancing, believing they were helping these afflicted souls work toward recovery. The guild halls opened their doors. The authorities cleared public spaces. Strasbourg transformed itself into a city designed to facilitate an epidemic. But medicine in 1518 never existed in isolation from the spiritual realm. The same physicians consulting their texts about humours were also considering supernatural explanations. Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, epileptics, and those suffering from nervous disorders, figured prominently in their theories. Had the people of Strasbourg somehow offended him? Was this divine punishment for moral failings, for gambling, drinking, prostitution, the everyday sins that city authorities were always trying to suppress? Pilgrimages were organized to shrines dedicated to St. Vitus. The afflicted were carried when they could no longer walk between their bouts of dancing. Prayers were chanted. Offerings were made. The church bells that marked time over Strasbourg rang out special peals, calling the faithful to seek intercession from the saints. Others whispered about darker forces. Demonic possession couldn't be ruled out. In a world where the devil was as real as the plague, where evil spirits were believed to walk among the living, the idea that demons had seized control of these dancers' bodies wasn't superstition. It was a legitimate medical hypothesis. Exorcisms were considered. Holy water was sprinkled. Priests held crosses before the dancers' faces, commanding any evil spirits to depart. The physicians tried bloodletting, that universal medieval remedy. If the blood was too hot, perhaps draining some away would help. Lancers opened veins. Blood flowed into bowls. The dancers kept dancing. Herbal remedies were prepared. Concoctions meant to cool the blood, calm the nerves, restore balance. Mandrake root, poppy extracts, mixtures whose recipes had been passed down through generations. Nothing changed. Astrologers were consulted. They studied the positions of planets and stars, searching for celestial explanations. Perhaps Mars was in an unfavorable aspect. Perhaps the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter had created some malevolent influence over the city. Charts were drawn. Calculations were made. Predictions were offered about when the plague might end. And then, after weeks of this medieval medical circus, after stages and musicians and prayers and bloodletting and herbal remedies and astrological consultations, after some dancers had died and others had danced until their bodies were broken, it simply stopped. No treatment proved effective. No intervention changed the course. The dancers, one by one, ceased their movements and collapsed. Some recovered. Some didn't. The city returned to its normal rhythms, leaving behind only questions and mass graves. But what was actually happening inside the bodies and minds of these dancers? The answer wouldn't come for nearly 500 years. And when it did, it revealed something far stranger than curses or humors. It revealed the terrifying power of the human brain under extreme stress. The dancers weren't cursed. They weren't possessed. They were experiencing something far more terrifying. Their own minds turning against them. The truth about the dancing plague wouldn't emerge until centuries later, when scientists studying similar phenomena began to piece together an explanation that medieval physicians could never have conceived. What happened in Strasbourg wasn't supernatural. It was something the human brain is capable of under very specific, very extreme conditions. It has a name now: mass psychogenic illness. Some call it mass hysteria, though that term carries unfortunate baggage. What matters is understanding what it actually means. The human brain is not simply a passive receiver of reality. It actively constructs what we experience filtering and interpreting every signal from our bodies and the world around us. Under normal circumstances, this works beautifully. But when the brain experiences prolonged, intense stress, when it's pushed past certain thresholds, something remarkable and disturbing can happen. It can generate physical symptoms that have no physical cause, real symptoms. Not imagined, not faked, but genuine physiological responses created entirely by psychological states. Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker of human suffering. In the years immediately before Frau Trophea began dancing, famine had swept through the region. Harvests failed. Grain prices soared beyond what common people could afford. Thousands died from starvation. Those who survived were weakened, malnourished, living in bodies that had consumed their own muscle tissue just to stay alive. Then came disease. A new wave of plague, not the Black Death of the previous century, but deadly nonetheless, crept through the population. Every cough, every fever carried the possibility of death. Into this atmosphere of desperation came the preachers. They stood in squares and shouted from church pulpits about God's coming judgment. The world was ending, they proclaimed. These disasters, the famine, the disease, the suffering, were divine punishment for human sin. Repent or face eternal damnation. For people already stretched to their psychological breaking point. These weren't abstract theological discussions. They were immediate, visceral threats. The brain, confronted with this cocktail of trauma, malnutrition, disease, and existential terror, began to malfunction in predictable ways. When Frau Trophea started dancing, Her brain had essentially created an involuntary response to unbearable stress. Her body moved without her conscious control, because the psychological pressure had found a physical outlet. And here's where the social component becomes crucial. Humans are deeply social creatures. Our brain contains specialized neurons, mirror neurons, that fire not just when we perform an action, but when we watch someone else perform that action. They're part of how we learn, how we empathize, how we understand each other. But they also make us susceptible to social contagion. When we see someone experiencing something, especially something emotionally charged, our brains begin to simulate that experience. Usually, this happens at a subconscious level. Usually, it doesn't create problems. But in a population already traumatized, already on the edge of psychological collapse, seeing someone dance uncontrollably could trigger the same response in another person's brain. Then another. Then dozens more. Each new dancer reinforced the behavior for everyone else. The brain, seeing this pattern repeated, interpreted it as a valid response to the unbearable conditions. The behavior spread like a virus, but the pathogen was psychological, not biological. This isn't ancient history. In 1962, at a boarding school in Tanganyika, a girl started laughing and couldn't stop. Within days, 95 students were affected. The school closed. The laughter spread to other schools. It took months to fade. In the 1980s and 90s, factory workers in the United States, primarily women in high-stress environments, experienced waves of mass fainting and mysterious illnesses that had no physical cause. Today, we see similar patterns in social media-induced conditions, where symptoms spread through online communities faster than any medieval plague. The medieval authorities' decision to encourage more dancing was catastrophic because it legitimized and reinforced the behavior. They built stages, hired musicians, created a framework that told everyone's brains, yes, this is the appropriate response. Dance, keep dancing. The very cure intensified the disease. There's another factor scientists discuss: ergot. This fungus grows on rye and other grains, especially during wet, cold growing seasons like those preceding 1518. When consumed, ergot causes hallucinations, convulsions, and a sensation of burning in the extremities. Some historians argue ergot poisoning contributed to the dancing plague. The truth likely lies in combination. Malnourished people eating contaminated grain while living under extreme psychological stress, creating perfect conditions for both physiological and psychological symptoms to merge into something unprecedented. The dancing plague revealed how the human mind can create physical reality from psychological terror. But dancing wasn't the only impossible thing happening in medieval Europe. Hundreds of miles away, in churches and monasteries, stone and wood were doing something that should have been equally impossible. They were bleeding. On a winter morning in 1290, monks discovered their crucifix bleeding. Within hours, the impossible had witnesses. Within weeks, it had changed the fate of an entire region. The monastery sat in a valley in what is now southern Germany, its stone walls thick enough to keep out winter's bite. Inside the chapel, darkness gathered in the corners even at midday. Candles provided the only light, their flames creating dancing shadows that made the painted saints on the walls seem almost alive. The air hung heavy with incense, frankincense and myrrh, the same spices brought to another infant in another stable centuries before. Brother Heinrich entered for morning prayers and saw it first. The crucifix mounted above the altar, a wooden Christ figure carved by craftsmen 2 generations earlier, had something wrong with it. In the candlelight, something dark and wet glistened on the figure's hands. He stepped closer. His breath caught. Red liquid was seeping from the nail wounds, gathering in droplets that caught the light before falling onto the white altar cloth below. He called for the others. They came running, their robes rustling in the stone silence. One by one, they witnessed what their brother had seen. The bleeding wasn't a trick of shadow or candlelight. It was real. They could see it flowing. Some claimed they could smell it. Iron and salt, the unmistakable scent of blood. The abbot was summoned. He examined the crucifix closely, touching the liquid with trembling fingers. It was warm. It stained his skin. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the monastery walls. By evening, villagers were gathering outside, demanding to see. Within days, the trickle became a flood. Pilgrims arrived from neighboring towns, then from distant cities. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons. They came sick, seeking healing. They came desperate, seeking signs. They came faithful, seeking confirmation that God still spoke to humanity in unmistakable ways. The church sent investigators. They were trained in skepticism, tasked with separating genuine miracles from fraud or delusion. They examined the crucifix from every angle. They searched for hidden tubes or containers that could deliver liquid to the wounds. They questioned the monks extensively, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They found nothing to suggest deception. After months of investigation, the declaration came: miraculous, divine intervention, proof of God's presence. The monastery's fortunes changed overnight. Pilgrims meant donations. Donations meant wealth. The valley that had been barely notable became a destination. New buildings rose. Roads improved. Markets expanded to serve the constant flow of visitors. The bleeding crucifix had transformed an entire economy. And it wasn't alone. Throughout the medieval period, reports of bleeding religious objects emerged with surprising regularity. In France, a statue of the Virgin Mary wept tears of blood. In Italy, a painted Christ bled from his crown of thorns. In Spain, a wooden saint dripped red from stigmata that shouldn't exist on a carved figure. Each event followed a similar pattern: discovery, investigation, declaration, pilgrimage, wealth. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Witnesses described the blood in detail, sometimes bright red and fresh, other times darker, almost black. Some said it was warm to the touch, others cold. Occasionally it had a smell sharp and metallic. Many claimed it had healing properties. The sick would touch cloths to the bleeding objects, then apply those cloths to their wounds or diseased flesh. These weren't minor superstitions dismissed by authorities. Bleeding statues influenced decisions at the highest levels of medieval society. Kings cited them as divine endorsement for military campaigns. Popes referenced them in theological debates. Town councils used them to settle disputes. The objects became repositories of power, spiritual, political, and economic. So were thousands of people lying. Were entire monasteries perpetrating elaborate frauds? Were communities hallucinating collectively? Or was something else happening, something that made perfect sense within the material world, but remained invisible to medieval understanding? Thousands saw these bleeding objects, Thousands prayed before them. But not a single person in medieval times asked the question that would eventually solve the mystery. What is blood made of? The blood that changed history wasn't miracle or hoax. It was a chemical reaction that required only three things: iron, water, and belief. Understanding what actually happened in those medieval monasteries and churches requires understanding something medieval craftsmen knew intimately but never connected to their bleeding statues. Iron changes when it meets water and air. They saw it every day in their tools, their nails, their hinges. They called it rust. They fought against it constantly, trying to keep their metalwork from degrading. But they never imagined that this same process, happening invisibly inside their sacred objects, could create something that looked exactly like a miracle. Medieval sculptures weren't carved from single pieces of wood. Craftsmen built them in sections, joining parts with iron nails and pins. The Christ figure's arms attached to the body with metal fixtures. The crown of thorns secured with iron wire. Inside these wooden structures, hidden from view, metal components held everything together. And metal, especially iron, oxidizes. When it does, it transforms into iron oxide, a compound that, dissolved in water, creates a distinctly reddish-brown liquid. The chemistry is elegantly simple. Iron atoms lose electrons when exposed to oxygen and water. This electron loss creates a new molecular structure, rust. When humidity condenses inside a wooden statue, particularly one kept in the temperature fluctuations of a medieval chapel, cold at night, warmer during services when bodies and candles heat the air, that moisture encounters iron fixtures. The rust dissolves into the water. The solution becomes mobile, seeping through wood grain, following paths of least resistance, emerging at natural weak points or carved indentations. Like the wounds on a crucifix. In dim candlelight, this reddish liquid dripping from nail wounds looks unmistakably like blood. The color matches almost perfectly. The consistency can be similar, especially if the rust concentration is right. It stains fabric. It has a faintly metallic smell. For someone expecting a miracle, for someone whose entire worldview includes divine intervention as a regular occurrence, the leap from liquid seeping from wounds to sacred blood requires no leap at all. It's the obvious explanation. But chemistry wasn't the only source of bleeding statues. Some were considerably less innocent. In 1448, a bishop in central France was exposed after a servant confessed to drilling tiny holes in a crucifix and filling them with pig's blood before important feast days. The investigation revealed an entire apparatus, thin tubes concealed in the wooden structure, small reservoirs that could be refilled, mechanisms that allowed controlled release of liquid. The bishop wasn't a skeptic creating a hoax out of malice. He was a believer who thought that creating miracles served God's purpose by strengthening faith and bringing pilgrims to his struggling diocese. This kind of pious fraud occurred more often than medieval records openly admit, though hints survive in church archives. A miracle meant wealth. Wealth meant power. Power meant influence. For some church officials, the temptation proved impossible to resist. They used animal blood, pig, sheep, sometimes chicken, stored in containers and strategically released. The blood would coagulate after exposure to air, creating what looked like fresh wounds repeatedly opening. The human mind contributed its own chemistry to these events. We're pattern-seeking creatures, wired to find meaning in randomness. In psychological terms, this is pareidolia. Seeing significance where none exists, a rust stain becomes blood. A discoloration becomes a tear, especially in flickering candlelight, where shadows move and colors shift. The eye can transform ordinary moisture into extraordinary miracle. Medieval painters faced their own bleeding problems. They created their red pigments from various sources. Iron oxide, yes, but also cinnabar, red lead, and organic dyes. Some of these pigments, particularly those mixed with egg tempera or certain oils, could liquefy in high humidity. A painted wound on a panel painting could quite literally appear to weep red liquid during damp seasons, particularly in poorly ventilated chapels where moisture accumulated. The believers weren't foolish. They were human, interpreting their observations through the only framework available to them. Rust and moisture could explain bleeding statues. But across medieval Europe, something else was bleeding. Something that couldn't be explained by chemistry alone. Entire communities were experiencing visions, convulsions, and symptoms that looked less like rust and more like possession. The bread that fed medieval Europe sometimes contained something else. A fungus that could turn a family dinner into a living nightmare. Every medieval peasant knew rye. It grew where wheat wouldn't, thrived in poor soil and harsh climates, sustained entire populations through long winters. Brown bread, dense and heavy, formed the foundation of their diet. A family might eat 2 pounds of it per person per day. That bread kept them alive. And sometimes it drove them mad. The fungus is called ergot. It grows on rye and other grains during specific weather conditions, particularly cool, damp springs followed by wet summers. The fungus replaces individual grain kernels with dark, elongated structures called sclerotia. To the untrained eye, contaminated grain looks almost normal, perhaps slightly darker. Perhaps with odd protrusions that could be mistaken for unusually shaped kernels. Nothing that would make a starving family reject a harvest. Inside those dark structures lies a chemical cocktail of terrifying potency. Ergot contains alkaloids closely related to LSD, lysergic acid derivatives that cross the blood-brain barrier and wreak havoc on neurotransmitter systems. But ergot's effects extend beyond hallucinations. It constricts blood vessels, cutting off circulation to extremities. It causes smooth muscles to contract violently. It affects every system in the body simultaneously. Medieval people called it Saint Anthony's fire, after the saint whose intercession they sought when the symptoms appeared. The burning came first, an intense sensation of heat in the hands and their feet, as though the limbs were being held in flames. Victims would plunge their arms into cold water, into snow, seeking any relief from the invisible fire consuming them. The burning wasn't metaphorical. As blood vessels constricted, tissue began to die. Fingers and toes turned black. Gangrene set in. Limbs became mummified while still attached to living bodies. Then came the convulsions. Muscles would contract uncontrollably, twisting bodies into impossible positions. Victims thrashed and jerked, unable to stop their own movements. Their faces contorted. They screamed from pain and terror. And through it all, the hallucinations, vivid, terrifying visions that made the distinction between reality and nightmare collapse entirely. In 944 CE, chroniclers in France recorded an outbreak that killed an estimated 40,000 people. They described the symptoms in detail. The burning, the rotting limbs, the madness. They attributed it to divine punishment, demonic attack, or corrupted air. They had no framework for understanding that the bread itself had become poison. Entire villages could be affected simultaneously because everyone ate from the same harvest. The grain was ground at the same mill, baked in the same ovens, distributed through the same markets. When ergo contaminated a region's supply, whole communities descended into shared nightmare. People saw angels and demons. They experienced religious ecstasies and apocalyptic terrors. They witnessed miracles that existed only in their poisoned perceptions. This explains so much of what plagued medieval Europe. The visions that sparked religious movements. The accusations of witchcraft against those exhibiting strange behavior. The convulsions that looked like demonic possession. Even some of the dancing plagues may have had ergo as a contributing factor, though rarely as the sole cause. The chemical structure of ergo alkaloids makes uncontrollable movement entirely plausible. Ergo thrived in medieval Europe's climate. The Little Ice Age brought exactly the conditions the fungus preferred: cool, wet growing seasons. Bad weather that ruined wheat harvests forced greater reliance on rye. The very conditions that made rye necessary also made it dangerous. Medieval agriculture, with its poor storage and limited ability to sort grain, ensured that contaminated kernels made it into the food supply. No one could see the connection. The fungus was nearly invisible. The concept of chemical contamination didn't exist. The time between eating contaminated bread and experiencing symptoms varied enough to prevent obvious correlation. And the symptoms themselves were so bizarre, so seemingly supernatural, that natural explanations seemed inadequate. The connection wasn't established until the 20th century, when scientists analyzing historical outbreaks noticed the patterns and tested preserved grain samples. Even now, historians debate which medieval phenomena can be attributed to ergot and which had other causes. The truth is complex. Multiple factors created the medieval experience: chemistry, psychology, environment, and belief. Ergo explained the burning, the hallucinations, the convulsions. But there was another symptom plaguing medieval Europe, one that seemed to defy any natural explanation: the transformation of human into beast. In 1589, a man was publicly executed for transforming into a wolf and eating children. The court records are precise, the witnesses were numerous, the confession was detailed. But werewolves don't exist. The bodies started appearing in the countryside around Bedburg, a small town near Cologne, in the spring of that year. First, a child went missing from the fields where she'd been tending sheep. Search parties found what remained of her 3 days later, parts scattered across a clearing, torn in ways that suggested animal attack, though no wolves had been seen in the region for years. Then another child disappeared. Then another. The mutilations became more frequent, more brutal. The community lived in growing terror. A hunting party spotted him in late October. A large, wolf-like creature moving through the forest with unnatural speed. They gave chase with dogs. The creature ran, but when cornered, something impossible happened according to their testimony. Instead of a wolf, they found a man. His name was Peter Stump, a farmer known in the area, though not well liked. He was breathing hard from the run. The dogs surrounded him, snarling. The hunters looked at each other, then at him, and in that moment decided they'd witnessed a transformation. He was arrested immediately. The trial began within days. Under questioning, which in 1589 meant torture, Stump confessed to crimes that stretched back 25 years. He described a belt given to him by the devil himself, a magical girdle that allowed him to assume the shape and strength of a wolf. When he wore it, he claimed, his body transformed. He grew fur. His teeth became fangs. His hands became paws. In this form, he said, he had killed 14 children and 2 pregnant women. He had torn them apart and consumed their flesh. The court accepted every word. His execution was designed to serve as both punishment and warning. On Halloween night, he was broken on the wheel, each limb methodically shattered with an iron-shod cartwheel. While still alive, flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers. Then he was beheaded. His body was burned on a pyre. The authorities erected a pole displaying the torture wheel, a wooden wolf figure, and Stump's severed head as a permanent reminder. His daughter and mistress, convicted as accomplices, were strangled and burned alongside him. The case file still exists. The trial transcript runs to dozens of pages. Multiple witnesses gave testimony. The confession was recorded in meticulous detail. Legal procedures were followed. This wasn't mob justice, it was official state execution for the crime of lycanthropy. And Stump's case was far from unique. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, thousands of people across Europe faced trial for being werewolves. In France, the courts heard hundreds of cases. In Germany, entire regions experienced waves of werewolf prosecutions. Switzerland, Austria, and the Low Countries all maintained official records of lycanthropy trials. The trial records reveal consistent patterns. Witnesses testified to seeing transformations, people shifting from human to wolf form before their eyes. Defendants, under torture, confessed to wearing magical pelts or belts, to making pacts with demons, to hunting and eating human prey while in beast form. The symptoms were catalogued with legal precision. Excessive body hair, elongated fingernails and teeth, unusual strength, aggressive behavior, cannibalistic urges. Some defendants claimed to remember their actions while transformed. Others said they experienced blackouts and woke to find blood on their hands. The church supported these prosecutions. Theologians wrote treatises explaining how demons could enable shape-shifting or create powerful illusions of transformation. The legal system created specific procedures for lycanthropy cases. Judges specialized in hearing them. Lawyers argued about burden of proof. Did transformation have to be witnessed, or was confession sufficient? If the magical belt was never found, as in Stump's case, did that matter? These weren't informal proceedings driven by ignorant mobs. They were part of the official apparatus of law and order, complete with documentation, appeals processes, and execution protocols. Society took werewolves as seriously as it took any other form of murder. If werewolves weren't real, what was actually happening to these people? To understand werewolf trials, we have to understand 3 things. The conditions that could make someone believe they were transforming, the diseases that could make them look like they were, and the society that needed someone to blame. The werewolves of medieval Europe had symptoms doctors can now diagnose with a blood test and a genetic screen. But in the 1500s, those symptoms had only one explanation: the devil. Imagine being born with a genetic mutation that causes hair to grow uncontrollably across your entire body. Your face becomes covered in thick fur. Hair sprouts from your forehead, your cheeks, even your eyelids. This condition exists. It's called hypertrichosis, specifically congenital generalized hypertrichosis when it affects the whole body. It's extremely rare, only about 50 documented cases in medical history. But those cases do exist. In medieval Europe, a child born with hypertrichosis would have looked like something between human and beast. The condition causes hair to grow in places and quantities that seem impossible. From a distance, or in dim light, such a person could genuinely appear to be covered in fur. For a population that believed in werewolves as absolute reality, the conclusion would have been inescapable. Then there's porphyria. This group of blood disorders creates a constellation of symptoms that, taken together, could easily be mistaken for lycanthropy. People with certain types of porphyria experience extreme sensitivity to sunlight. Exposure causes painful blistering and scarring. This would drive sufferers to become nocturnal, emerging only after dark. The disease can cause gums to recede and tighten, making teeth appear longer and more prominent, almost fang-like. Urine turns reddish or purple due to the buildup of porphyrins. Some forms cause psychiatric symptoms: confusion, anxiety, hallucinations. The skin becomes photosensitive and can take on a darkened, damaged appearance. A person with severe porphyria, living nocturnally to avoid sun exposure, with prominent teeth and altered behavior, would have triggered every medieval alarm bell for supernatural transformation. King George III of England is now believed to have suffered from porphyria, experiencing episodes of apparent madness that baffled his physicians. Centuries earlier, such symptoms might have led to execution. Clinical lycanthropy represents another piece of the puzzle. This is a genuine psychiatric condition where patients experience the delusion that they are transforming into an animal, most commonly a wolf. The delusion is so powerful that it affects behavior. Patients have been documented growling, attempting to walk on all fours, claiming to see fur growing on their bodies. The condition appears in medical literature across centuries and cultures. It's rare but real. Modern psychiatry treats it with antipsychotic medications. But in medieval times, it could only be interpreted as actual transformation. Rabies adds another layer. This viral infection, transmitted through animal bites, causes hydrophobia, a painful inability to swallow that makes victims appear to fear water. It causes extreme aggression, confusion, and violent behavior. People with rabies can become unpredictably dangerous, attacking others without apparent reason. The disease also causes hypersalivation, making victims foam at the mouth. In an era when wolves were common and wolf attacks happened regularly, a person infected with rabies from a wolf bite would exhibit behavior that seemed to confirm they'd been cursed by the attacking animal. History provides us with a poignant example. Petrus Gonsalvus, born in 1537 in Tenerife with hypertrichosis. Rather than being killed as a monster, he was brought to the French court of King Henry II and treated as a curiosity. He was educated, married, and had children, some of whom inherited his condition. Portraits of the family survive. They show people who are unmistakably human, yet covered in hair in ways that defy normal human appearance. Gonsalvus lived during the height of werewolf trials. In another place, another circumstance, he might have been executed. Multiple conditions could appear together. a person with hypertrichosis who also suffered from epileptic seizures, someone with porphyria who developed rabies, a patient with clinical lycanthropy triggered by ergot poisoning. The medieval world had no framework for separating these medical realities from supernatural explanation. Medical conditions explained the appearance and behavior, but they didn't explain why thousands of people confessed to being werewolves, describing their transformations in vivid detail. For that answer, we have to understand the most terrifying interrogation method ever devised: judicial torture. Every werewolf confession in medieval Europe followed the same pattern: denial, screaming, and then suddenly, detailed admissions of impossible transformations. The confessions weren't evidence of werewolves, they were evidence of torture. The rack-stretched bodies until joints dislocated and tendons tore. Thumbscrews crushed fingers one agonizing turn at a time. Strappado suspended victims by their wrists, tied behind their backs, shoulders wrenching from their sockets as the full weight of the body pulled downward. The breaking wheel shattered limbs systematically, bone by bone. These weren't barbaric exceptions to medieval justice, they were standard procedure, legally sanctioned methods for extracting confession. The logic seemed airtight to medieval authorities. Confession was required for conviction. Physical evidence of werewolf transformation, the magical belt, the actual moment of shape-shifting, was impossible to obtain. Therefore, torture became the primary investigative tool. The accused would eventually tell the truth under sufficient pain, or so they believed. Modern psychological research reveals what medieval courts couldn't understand. Torture doesn't extract truth. It manufactures whatever the torturer wants to hear. When pain reaches certain thresholds, the human mind prioritizes ending that pain above all else, including maintaining factual accuracy. People will confess to anything. They'll admit to flying. They'll describe meetings with the devil. They'll provide detailed accounts of transforming into wolves, even though they know intellectually that such things are impossible. Peter Stump's confession followed this predictable trajectory. He initially denied all charges. Then, as torture intensified, he admitted to wearing a magical belt. Under continued pain, the story expanded. He'd received it from Satan himself. More torture produced more details. The belt allowed transformation, gave him wolf strength, enhanced his senses. With each session, the narrative grew more elaborate, more impossible, more exactly what his interrogators expected to hear. The process created circular reasoning that seemed to confirm werewolf existence. Interrogators had preconceived ideas about how lycanthropy worked based on folklore, previous trials, and theological texts. During torture, they would ask leading questions. Did the devil give you the belt? The victim, desperate to end pain, would agree. What color was it? The victim would guess. Did it make you grow fur, sir? Agreement again. The interrogator would record these answers as independent confirmation of werewolf lore, never recognizing that he'd fed every detail to the victim. The brain, under extreme duress, engages in confabulation, creating false memories to explain trauma. Torture victims often come to genuinely believe their coerced confessions, at least temporarily. The mind constructs a narrative that makes sense of the pain, incorporating suggested details into what feels like actual memory. This neurological response to trauma was invisible to medieval justice systems. Werewolf accusations targeted society's margins, the mentally ill, whose behavior seemed inexplicable. People with medical conditions that created disturbing appearances. Social outcasts who violated community norms. Those who lived alone, who were poor, who made neighbors uncomfortable. When children went missing or bodies turned up mutilated, communities needed someone to blame. The strange person living at the edge of town became the obvious suspect. Some accused werewolves may have been genuine criminals, serial killers or violent predators whose real crimes were horrifying enough without supernatural embellishment. But medieval society lacked frameworks for understanding psychopathy or serial violence. The crimes were so terrible that they demanded extraordinary explanation. A man who murdered children couldn't just be a man who murdered children. He had to be something more, something demonic, something transformed. The werewolf trials reveal an uncomfortable truth about human societies under stress. When faced with inexplicable horror, murdered children, brutal violence, widespread fear, people don't just seek explanations, they seek scapegoats. They need someone to punish, someone whose execution will restore order and safety, even if that person is innocent. The torture ensures confession. The confession enables execution. The execution provides catharsis. Werewolf trials revealed how fear and ignorance could turn medicine into murder. But they weren't the darkest chapter of medieval justice. That distinction belongs to another hunt, one that killed tens of thousands and whose effects rippled through centuries. The witch trials were about to begin. In village after village, young women began to choke on nothing, convulse without cause, and speak in voices that weren't their own. The diagnosis was always the same: witchcraft. The cure was death. The pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. A girl would wake one morning unable to move her legs, or she'd collapse during church services, her body rigid and trembling. Or she'd claim invisible hands were strangling her, clawing at her throat while terrified witnesses saw nothing but her gasping for air. Within days, others in the community would begin experiencing similar symptoms. Within weeks, someone would be accused. Within months, someone would burn. The trial records preserve these symptoms in meticulous detail. In Salem in 1692, young girls convulsed so violently that grown men couldn't hold them still. They contorted into positions that seemed to defy human anatomy. They spoke in voices, deep, guttural, masculine, that couldn't possibly come from their own throats. They screamed about being pricked by invisible pins, and when examined, tiny puncture wounds appeared on their skin with no visible cause. At Pendle in Lancashire, England, in 1612, accusers reported feeling sudden choking sensations when certain women looked at them. They described paralysis that struck without warning, rendering them unable to speak or move. They claimed to see spectral cats, dogs, and human figures that others couldn't perceive. Visions so vivid they could describe them in precise detail under oath. The Würzburg witch trials in Germany between 1626 and 1631 documented hundreds of cases with identical symptom profiles. Victims reported being physically attacked by invisible assailants. They exhibited sudden fits of violent behavior, followed by periods of complete stillness. They spoke prophecies and revelations they claimed came from supernatural sources. Young children, some as young as 7, testified to seeing witches flying through the air or meeting with the devil in the forest. These weren't isolated incidents. The symptoms appeared across Europe and in France, Scotland, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland. separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time. Yet the accounts remained remarkably consistent. The afflicted choked. They seized. They spoke strangely. They saw visions. They bore mysterious marks on their bodies. Medieval and early modern authorities developed elaborate diagnostic procedures. They searched bodies for witch marks, moles, birthmarks, or scars supposedly left when the devil marked his servants. Any unusual skin irregularity became evidence. They performed swimming tests, binding suspects and throwing them into water. The logic seemed sound. Water, being pure and used in baptism, would reject the impure. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank and drowned, you were innocent, though posthumously. When physical evidence proved insufficient, authorities turned to the tool that had served them in werewolf trials: torture. The methods were identical. The results were predictable. Confessions poured forth. Detailed admissions of flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, cursing neighbors, spoiling crops, killing infants. Each confession reinforced the reality of witchcraft in official minds. The scale of persecution defies easy comprehension. Current historical estimates suggest between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe between 1400 and 1782. The peak occurred from 1560 to 1630, when fear reached epidemic proportions. Entire villages were decimated. In some German regions, so many people were executed that not enough remained to farm the land. The victims were overwhelmingly women, approximately 80%. Many were elderly or poor or unmarried, already socially vulnerable before accusations began. The symptoms were real. The accusations were genuine. But the witches, those were fiction. To understand what actually happened, we have to look at the same culprit behind the dancing plagues. The power of the stressed human brain, amplified this time by something even more dangerous: adolescence. The teenage girls experiencing seizures and claiming to be bewitched weren't lying. Their brains were producing real symptoms from a real cause. But that cause wasn't witches. It was something far more mundane and far more tragic: stress, powerlessness, and biology. The adolescent female brain occupies a unique neurological state. During puberty, regions governing social awareness and emotional processing that undergo dramatic reorganization. Mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we act and when we observe others acting, become hyperactive. This heightened social sensitivity serves evolutionary purposes, helping young people navigate complex social hierarchies. But it also creates vulnerability. When one adolescent girl experiences symptoms, others nearby unconsciously begin mimicking those symptoms at a neurological level, often without conscious awareness or intent. Stress hormones add fuel to this neurological fire. Cortisol and adrenaline, released during prolonged anxiety, don't just create emotional distress, they produce tangible physical effects. Muscles tense and spasm, breathing patterns alter, heart rates spike. The nervous system, overwhelmed by constant activation, can misfire in ways that create seizures, paralysis, or altered states of consciousness. These aren't imagined symptoms. They're genuine neurological responses to psychological stress. Conversion disorder represents the clinical term for this phenomenon: psychological distress converting into neurological symptoms. The medieval term was possession. Both describe the same reality: a brain under such extreme pressure that it manifests internal turmoil, as external physical crisis. The social context of witch trials created perfect conditions for mass psychogenic illness to flourish. Young women in Puritan and medieval Christian societies lived under suffocating restrictions. They couldn't choose their husbands, couldn't own property, couldn't speak in church, couldn't make decisions about their own lives. They worked from dawn to dusk. They faced punishment for minor infractions. They absorbed constant messages about their inherent sinfulness and inferiority. Then something remarkable happened when symptoms appeared. Suddenly, these powerless girls commanded attention. Adults listened to them. Ministers recorded their words. Magistrates acted on their accusations. The normal social hierarchy inverted. A teenage girl's testimony could destroy a wealthy landowner, silence a town elder, condemn a respected matriarch. For young women with no other avenue to agency or voice, the unconscious appeal of this power was immense. Salem provides the clearest example. Teenage girls like Betty Paris and Abigail Williams went from invisible servants to the most important people in Massachusetts. Their accusations brought down merchant William Burroughs, tavern owner Bridget Bishop, and landowner Rebecca Nurse. Courts hung on their every word. The entire colony reorganized around their experiences. Other factors amplified the neurological susceptibility. These communities practiced sleep deprivation as routine. 12 to 16-hour workdays left little time for rest. Nutritional deficiencies were common, particularly vitamin B deficiencies that affect neurological function. And ergot poisoning likely played a role in some outbreaks. The fungus appeared repeatedly in our story for good reason. It was endemic in European grain supplies, particularly during the wet, cold growing seasons of the Little Ice Age. Modern science has documented identical phenomena. In 2011, at Leroy High School in upstate New York, teenage girls began developing sudden tics, verbal outbursts, and involuntary movements. The symptoms spread through the school's female population. Parents demanded environmental testing. Media descended. Neurologists eventually diagnosed mass psychogenic illness, real symptoms with no physical pathogen. The social dynamics mirrored Salem. Stress, social connection among the affected girls, and widespread attention reinforcing the behavior. Understanding witch trial symptoms as neurological responses rather than lies or demonic possession reframes history profoundly. The accusers weren't malicious fabricators. They were stressed adolescents whose brains responded to unbearable circumstances in the only way available. The accused weren't guilty of supernatural crimes. They were victims of a society that needed explanations for phenomena it couldn't understand. The tragedy lies in the collision of real symptoms, genuine fear, and complete ignorance of neuroscience. Everyone involved believed they were confronting supernatural evil. The symptoms seemed to prove witchcraft existed. The confessions seemed to confirm specific guilt. The science of mass psychogenic illness explains the symptoms, but it doesn't explain the confessions. How did thousands of accused witches describe in detail their meetings with Satan, their flights through the night sky, their pacts with demons? The answer lies in a plant that grows in every European garden, and a very different kind of chemistry. The witches who confessed to flying weren't lying about the experience. The ointments they described in their confessions have been recreated in modern labs. And yes, they really do make you feel like you're flying. Trial transcripts and medieval grimoires preserve recipes that seem like pure fantasy at first glance. instructions for creating magical ointments, written in careful detail, listing botanical ingredients and preparation methods. Belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake root, hemlock, poplar leaves. These plants appear repeatedly across different regions and time periods. Their names recorded by court scribes as accused witches described their craft. Modern pharmacology recognizes every one of these plants. More importantly, it understands what they do to the human nervous system. They contain tropone alkaloids, powerful psychoactive compounds that cross the blood-brain barrier and wreak havoc on neurotransmitter function. These aren't mild substances. They're potent deliriants and hallucinogens that create experiences unlike anything produced by other psychoactive drugs. Belladonna contains atropine and scopolamine. Henbane provides hyoscyamine. Mandrake delivers similar alkaloid compounds. When absorbed into the bloodstream, these chemicals block acetylcholine receptors throughout the nervous system, creating a cascade of effects. Vision blurs. Heart rate accelerates. Body temperature rises. And consciousness itself begins to fragment. The hallucinations produced by tropane alkaloids differ fundamentally from those caused by substances like psilocybin or LSD. Users don't experience enhanced colors or geometric patterns. Instead, they encounter complete alterations of perceived reality. They see people who aren't there. They have conversations with entities that seem entirely real. They experience sensations of floating, flying, or leaving their bodies entirely. The hallucinations are so convincing that distinguishing them from reality becomes impossible. Historical accounts describe the application method with remarkable consistency. The ointments were applied to mucous membranes, areas where thin tissue allows rapid absorption directly into the bloodstream. This explains the cultural association between witches and broomsticks. Though the reality was less theatrical and more physiological, mucous membrane absorption bypasses the digestive system, delivering compounds directly to circulation and allowing faster, more intense effects. The experience would begin within minutes, a sensation of lightness. Then the room would begin to shift and transform. Within an hour, the user would be deep in a hallucinogenic state that could last 8 to 12 hours. During that time, they might genuinely believe they were flying through the night sky. They might attend elaborate gatherings that felt absolutely real. They might encounter demonic figures and engage in rituals that seemed to occur in physical space. When interrogators later asked these individuals to describe their experiences, they recounted what they remembered: flying, meeting others at Sabbaths, encountering supernatural beings. From their perspective, these weren't lies. These were memories of events that had seemed to occur. The ointments had created experiences that felt indistinguishable from reality. Some accused witches may have deliberately used these substances, believing genuinely in their magical properties. The line between medicine and magic didn't exist in medieval folk practice. The same herbs that treated illness were believed to hold supernatural power. A woman who understood the properties of belladonna might use it medicinally and magically without seeing any contradiction. Her knowledge of plants made her valuable to her community, until that same knowledge made her suspect. There's a darker possibility that historical records hint at but rarely state explicitly. Some interrogators may have administered these substances to accused witches, either to produce visions that seem to confirm guilt or to make suspects more susceptible to suggestion during questioning. A person under the influence of tropine alkaloids becomes highly suggestible, their grip on reality already compromised. Modern researchers have recreated these historical recipes under laboratory conditions. The results confirm what trial records suggested. These mixtures produce exactly the effects described in witch confessions: feelings of flight, vivid hallucinations, encounters with entities that seem real, complete temporal disorientation. Hallucinogenic ointments explained some confessions. Mass psychogenic illness explained the symptoms. But across medieval Europe, there were other mysteries that seemed to defy every natural law. Entire villages would vanish overnight. Wells would turn blood red without explanation. And sometimes, the earth itself would open and swallow the living whole. In 1287, a storm hit the English coast. When morning came, Winchelsea was gone. Not damaged, not destroyed, gone. 300 buildings, thousands of people, vanished beneath the sea in a single night. The storm arrived without warning on a February evening, driving waves higher than anyone had seen before. Residents of Winchelsea, a prosperous port town perched on shingle banks at the mouth of the River Breda, retreated to their homes as wind tore at shutters and rain hammered through streets. They'd weathered storms before. The town had stood for generations. Stone churches, timber-framed houses, warehouses filled with wool and wine. All the infrastructure of a thriving medieval community. By dawn, the sea had reclaimed everything. Where streets and buildings had stood, only churning grey water remained. Bodies washed up on distant beaches for weeks. Survivors who'd fled inland returned to find no trace of their former lives. The storm surge had been so powerful, so complete, that it erased the town from the landscape. A new Winchelsea would eventually be built on higher ground, but the old town simply ceased to exist. Medieval chroniclers recorded the disaster with a mixture of precision and theological interpretation. God's judgment, they wrote, had fallen upon a sinful community. The sea had become his instrument of divine retribution. What else could explain such total destruction? Winchelsea wasn't unique. It wasn't even unusual. Across medieval Europe, villages disappeared with disturbing frequency. Historians have documented over 3,000 villages that vanished in England alone between 1300 and 1500. Some left ruins. Some left nothing but names in old tax records and empty fields where buildings once stood. The mechanisms of disappearance varied. Coastal erosion claimed dozens of settlements. Dunwich, once among England's largest ports, progressively vanished beneath the North Sea over centuries. Medieval writers recorded the eerie phenomenon of church bells ringing from underwater ruins, supposedly audible during storms when waves churned the seabed. 8 medieval churches, entire neighborhoods, thousands of buildings, all consumed by advancing waves. Inland, different terrors awaited. German chroniclers documented villages that collapsed into sudden sinkholes, the earth literally opening to swallow homes and people. One account from Bavaria describes how residents woke to find cracks spreading through their village. Within hours, buildings began tilting and falling. By evening, a crater 50 feet deep had replaced the town square. Survivors described the sound, a deep groaning from beneath the earth, then cracking, then screams. Flooding accounted for more disappearances. Rivers changed course during massive storms, abandoning old channels and carving new ones directly through villages. The Black Death contributed in different ways. Depopulated villages were simply abandoned, their buildings left to decay until nothing recognizable remained. Economic shifts emptied others as populations moved towards cities or more profitable lands. But the truly terrifying disappearances were the sudden ones. Villages present at sunset, gone by dawn. Communities erased so completely that later generations questioned whether they'd existed at all. So, these events reinforced apocalyptic beliefs that ran through medieval Christianity. The world was ending. God's judgment was imminent. Your village, your home, your life could vanish as divine punishment at any moment. This existential uncertainty shaped medieval consciousness profoundly. You couldn't trust the ground beneath your feet. Prosperity meant nothing if the sea could reclaim your town overnight. Wealth and security were illusions. Only the soul mattered. Because physical existence was temporary and fragile. Churches thrived on this terror, offering spiritual insurance against temporal catastrophe. Eyewitness accounts that survive in monastic chronicle describe the immediate experience of disaster. The ground shaking, water rising impossibly fast, buildings groaning and collapsing, people running with whatever they could carry, often not even that. The survivors wandering afterward through landscapes transformed beyond recognition, searching for landmarks that no longer existed. Medieval people believed these disappearances were acts of God. They were partly right, but the God was geology, and it had been planning these disasters for millions of years. The ground beneath medieval villages wasn't solid. It was honeycomb, limestone riddled with caves and underground rivers. And eventually, inevitably, the honeycombs collapsed. Beneath the calm surface of fields and cottages, water had been at work for centuries, dissolving the stone grain by grain, creating vast, unseen caverns. All it took was time, pressure, and a little more rain than usual for the earth to swallow what humans had built. Limestone, the quiet architect of so many cathedrals and castles, was also a secret saboteur in places like southern England, northern France, and the rolling heartlands of Germany. Entire villages stood atop porous foundations. Medieval builders never knew. Their wells reached down into the same veins of water that gnawed at the rock beneath. Each bucket drawn, each cellar dug, thinned the fragile crust separating life above from the slow erosion below. And then, without warning, the ground simply gave way. Accounts from the time spoke of houses vanishing overnight, of roads cracking open like torn fabric. To them, it was divine wrath, a punishment. But today, we know these were sinkholes, sudden collapses, where the roof of a hidden cavern finally yielded to gravity. The earth, tired of holding its breath, exhaled. The medieval landscape was already unstable, even without the help of human hands. When the warmth of Europe's mild centuries began to fade around 1300 CE, the weather turned restless. Storms multiplied, rain lingered, and coastlines began to crumble. The sea, too, was hungry. In England's east and the shores of Normandy, the chalk cliffs and soft sands offered little resistance. Coastal erosion is a slow dance of waves and sediment, guided by something called longshore drift, the steady sideways movement of sand and shingle along the coast. Each wave steals a little ground, carrying it farther down the line. Over time, beaches migrate, headlands dissolve, and the outlines on old maps lose their shape. During calm periods, this happens over centuries. But as the climate cooled, the storms came harder, faster. The balance broke. In the winter of 1287, the North Sea rose up in fury. Known now as the Great Storm, it struck from England to the Netherlands with catastrophic force. Entire ports disappeared. The town of Dunwich, once among England's largest, began its long drowning. The storm tore open river mouths, flooded estuaries, and carved new coastlines in a single night. Tens of thousands perished, their towns rewritten by wind and tide. For those who survived, it must have felt as though the world itself had changed shape. And it had. Yet not all disappearances came from above. Sometimes the danger stirred from beneath. In stable lands like Britain or northern France, earthquakes were rare, but not impossible. Modern geological records reveal ancient fault lines threading quietly below the surface. When they shifted, the trembling earth could liquefy the very soil beneath heavy stone homes. Saturated sands momentarily became fluid, foundations sank, and entire streets slumped into the mud. Medieval builders had no defense against such forces. Their walls were thick but inflexible. Their foundations shallow, trusting the ground to remain still. When it didn't, the weight of the stone turned fatal. A house built to last 100 years might crumble in seconds. Today, modern surveys and sonar scans along Europe's coasts reveal the ghosts of those lost places. Beneath the North Sea, divers have found submerged streets, timber posts, and traces of harbour walls. The seabed tells the story the chronicles couldn't. Not of divine punishment, but of natural law, geology and weather conspiring in silence. The hungry earth took what was built upon it, reshaping the map of Europe one collapse at a time. And while the people of the Middle Ages prayed for mercy, the truth was far colder. The world beneath them was always shifting, always ready to reclaim what was never truly theirs. Geology explained why villages disappeared into the earth, but it didn't explain everything. Across medieval Europe, people reported another type of disappearance, one that happened to the sky itself. On March 19, 1472, the sun disappeared. Not an eclipse. Those lasted minutes. This darkness lasted hours, and it terrified a continent. Across Europe, from the Rhineland to Florence, chroniclers wrote of a noon that turned to midnight. The sky dimmed first to a bruised red, then to black. Birds fell silent. Farmers dropped their tools. In some towns, people lit candles in the streets, watching in disbelief as stars began to shimmer overhead in the middle of the day. The churches filled. Bells rang without rhythm. Some prayed. Others screamed. The end of the world, they thought, had finally arrived. The chroniclers agreed on the timing, but not on the cause. In France, one monk claimed the sun had been swallowed by a dragon. In England, it was said to be the devil's shadow passing over the world. In Italy, a scribe wrote that God had turned his face away. Yet when astronomers checked the heavens, they found no eclipse. The sun had vanished, but the moon was nowhere near it. Something else had darkened the sky. It wasn't the first time. In the summer of 1258, the same dread returned. For months, a strange pall hung over Europe, a dimness that dulled even midday light. Crops failed, the air smelled of ash, and the year became known as the summer without sun. People blamed sin, sorcery, the stars. the truth would not be known for centuries. That somewhere across the world, a volcano had torn itself apart, filling the atmosphere with ash that drifted on the wind, blotting out the light of day. But even that was not the earliest. In the chronicles of far older times, another shadow looms. The years 535 and 536 CE. The historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and for nearly 2 years the world seemed to live beneath a twilight sky. Harvests failed from Ireland to China, temperatures then fell, and famine swept across continents. The cause, now traced to a massive eruption, perhaps entombed to Iceland, perhaps in the tropics, ushered in one of the coldest decades in human history. For the people who lived through it, it must have felt as though the very sun had died. Darkness was more than a fear. It was a messenger. In every age, its arrival foretold hunger. When the light dimmed, plants withered. The harvest faltered. Famine followed. And famine brought the shadow of death. To the medieval mind, this was no coincidence but divine warning. Chroniclers often linked the dark days to plague years, to comets, to the trembling of the ground itself. Every sign seemed to echo the same message. The balance between heaven and earth had broken. Even in later centuries, the pattern repeated. In the summer of 1783, a dense haze settled over Europe. The sun hung like a red coin behind a curtain of fog. People coughed as they breathed it. Livestock sickened, crops shriveled, and rain carried a sour taste. The haze lingered for months, dulling the world into grey. Its true source was far away, a fissure in Iceland called Leki, belching sulphur into the sky. The fog drifted southward, wrapping Europe in poison. Historians would later connect that suffocating summer to the hardships that sparked revolution. Eclipses could explain some dark days, but not all. Many of these episodes lasted far too long, sometimes for days, when the moon's shadow could only darken the world for minutes. Something else was stealing the light, a force vast enough to dim half the planet. To the people of the Middle Ages, the heavens had turned hostile. They looked upward for answers, never knowing that the true source of the darkness lay far below. The answer wasn't in the sky. It was in the earth, but not the earth beneath medieval villages. It was in mountains thousands of miles away. Mountains that were about to change history by exploding. In 1257, a mountain on an island most Europeans had never heard of exploded with the force of several 100 million tons of TNT. Within a year, 1 million Europeans were dead. None of them ever knew why. On the island of Lombok, in what is now Indonesia, Mount Samalas tore itself apart. The eruption was so vast that the mountain ceased to exist as it had been, replaced by a caldera miles wide. The quiet blue lake now called Segara Anak. But in the 13th century, the world didn't see the mountain's end. What it saw was the sky change. Ash and sulphur burst into the stratosphere, rising higher than any storm could reach, spreading into a veil that wrapped around the entire planet. For years afterward, sunlight arrived dim and cold, filtered through a mist of fine sulfuric particles that turned the skies red and the world grey. In Europe, people had no name for it. The year 1258 began strangely. The mornings were hazy, the sun dull and copper-coloured. Chroniclers in England wrote of a dry fog that dimmed the day. In France, there were reports of the air smelling of sulphur, of a stinging rain that burned the skin. Farmers noticed that the seasons no longer behaved. Summer came late and weak. Frosts struck early. The harvest failed. Across the continent, hunger spread faster than rumor. The wheat rotted in the fields. Barley and rye would not sprout. Rivers flooded, then dried to mud. Famine followed famine until people began to starve in the streets. In London, bodies were left unburied because there were too many to count. In Paris, bread riots turned violent. In the German states, villages emptied as survivors fled toward towns that could barely feed themselves. It was called the Great Famine of 1258-1259, a catastrophe that no war or plague could match. What the people of Europe could not know was that the cause of their suffering had begun half a world away. The eruption of Mount Samalas had released more sulfur dioxide than any event in the last 7 centuries. More than even Krakatoa, more than Vesuvius. Once in the stratosphere, that sulfur combined with water vapor to form aerosols, tiny droplets that reflected sunlight back into space. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius. A change that sounds small, but was enough to shorten growing seasons, shift rainfall, and trigger chaos across ecosystems. The world had entered a volcanic winter. It wouldn't be the last. Nearly 6 centuries later, in A15, another Indonesian mountain, Tambora, erupted with terrifying force. Its ash cloud darkened the skies of the entire northern hemisphere, giving rise to what became known as the year without a summer. Snow fell in June. Rivers froze in July. Crops failed again, and the hungry wandered through Europe just as their ancestors had. The difference was that by 1815, the cause could finally be seen and measured. Scientists connected the dots between volcanoes and global cooling. But in 1258, such understanding was impossible. To the medieval mind, the darkened sun was an omen, the sulphurous fog a sign of hell's breath. Modern science later confirmed what they could not. Deep in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, layers of trapped air hold the signature of that lost eruption. Spikes of sulfur and ash that match exactly with the years of darkness and famine recorded in European chronicles. These ice cores are time capsules, silent witnesses proving that the sky's strange pull and the Earth's suffering shared a single origin. Volcanic aerosols do more than steal warmth. They paint the sky. The same haze that dims the sun also scatters light into brilliant crimson at dusk. The blood-red sunsets described in medieval manuscripts were not omens of war or wrath, but physics, the long path of sunlight through a world clouded by sulfur. Yet to those who saw them, the color meant something else. Judgment. As the cold deepened and food grew scarce, Europe became a crucible of fear. Famine weakened bodies, and weakened bodies succumbed to sickness. Hunger unbalanced minds. Outbreaks of hysteria, strange illnesses, and witch trials all flourished in the wake of these silent winters. The world was changing, but no one could see the hand that turned the wheel. The year without summer, it turned out, had happened before. And it would happen again. Every few centuries, a mountain somewhere far away would rise into fire, and the air would change. And each time, humanity would struggle to understand why the light dimmed, why the fields failed, and why the sky itself seemed to mourn. Volcanic eruptions explained the sudden darkness, the famines, the climate chaos, but they also triggered something else, something that would kill far more people than the eruptions themselves. Disease. The Black Death didn't just appear, it was invited. By decades of cooling climate, failed harvests, and a population weakened by starvation. The plague killed 50 million people, but climate change made them vulnerable. For centuries, Europe had thrived beneath a gentler sun. From about 950 to 1250 CE, the medieval warm period brought long growing seasons, mild winters, and fertile lands. Crops flourished, populations expanded, and new villages spread into mountain valleys and northern plains that had once been too cold to farm. Grain filled granaries, and people believed the balance of the world was secure. But climates shift slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day they don't. Around 1300, the warmth began to fade. Summers grew shorter, rains heavier, winters longer and sharper. Rivers froze that had not frozen in generations. The harvest began to fail. The great turning point came in 1315, when relentless rain drowned fields from England to Poland. The next year was worse. Grain sprouted with mold, livestock starved, and by 1317, Europe had entered what chroniclers called the Great Famine. Millions died. Parents abandoned children. Travelers found roads littered with the dead, and entire villages vanished into silence. Those who survived carried scars deeper than hunger. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened immunity. Diseases that had once been mild now turned deadly. The human body, deprived of nutrition, becomes an easy host, its defenses dulled, its resilience gone. And hunger does not stay still. When crops fail, people move. They flee to cities, ports, monasteries, anywhere food might be found. In doing so, they carry pathogens across borders, across continents. The climate, too, shaped the lives of creatures no one thought to blame. Rats and fleas thrived or vanished depending on warmth, humidity, and food supply. In the warmest centuries, stable climates had kept rodent populations steady. But as the weather turned erratic, their numbers rose and fell in violent swings. Wet years brought abundance. Dry years forced migrations. The fleas that lived on them, tiny, near invisible, followed their hosts into barns, ships, and homes. Somewhere in the tangled web of Asian trade routes, the bacterium Yersinia pestis found a perfect home. Fleas carrying it lived on wild rodents across Central Asia, their populations swelling after periods of warmth and moisture. When drought struck, the starving rodents fled toward human settlements, carrying the disease with them. It spread westward along caravan routes, silently boarding ships that sailed to the Black Sea and beyond. By 1347, it reached Europe. When the first infected ships docked in Sicily, death followed them inland. Within months, the plague consumed the continent. But its ferocity was not random. It met a people already broken. Decades of cold and hunger had eroded their health. The weakened immune systems of Europe's poor made infection almost always fatal. Towns emptied in days. In some places, 9 of every 10 inhabitants perished. Modern science has illuminated what medieval minds could not. DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims buried in London, Paris, and Lubeck confirms that Yersinia pestis was the killer. Yet isotopic studies of those same skeletons reveal chronic malnutrition in the years before the plague's arrival, deficiencies in iron, calcium, and protein, signs of long hunger and stress. The epidemic did not simply descend from the east. It found its way into bodies already too weak to resist. Even after the Black Death's first wave ended in 1351, it returned again and again, less deadly but persistent. Each resurgence followed climate dips, years of failed harvests, bitter winters, erratic rains. The pattern became almost rhythmic. Cold, famine, plague, recovery, and then cold again. Europe lived under a pendulum of climate and disease that swung for centuries. The Black Death was not only a biological event, it was the culmination of environmental collapse. The earth cooled, the crops failed, and the body followed. Climate explained why diseases spread when they did, but it didn't explain all the symptoms. Because during plague outbreaks, people reported something medical science says should be impossible. They were bleeding from their eyes, their skin was turning black, and they were dying within hours. Some of these symptoms weren't plague at all. The Black Death wasn't one disease. It was 5, maybe 10, all striking at once. Medieval Europe wasn't fighting a plague. It was fighting a biological perfect storm. When the chronicles speak of pestilence, they use one word for everything: plaga, the plague. Anything that killed swiftly and spread widely was folded into that single name. To the medieval mind, the cause mattered less than the terror it brought. But modern science has started to untangle the threads, and what emerges is not a single pathogen, but a tapestry of overlapping epidemics feeding on the same weakened host, Europe itself. In the mid-14th century, Yersinia pestis was indeed present. DNA extracted from mass graves in London, Barcelona, and Lübeck confirms it. The bacterium spread by fleas on rats, causing the bubonic form of plague. Those black swellings in the groin and under the arms that gave the disease its name. Yet not all the deaths fit that pattern. Some chronicles describe people dying within hours, before any swelling appeared. Others speak of victims coughing blood, their lungs filling with fluid, the infection leaping from person to person through the air. Those accounts fit pneumonic plague or influenza. And still others mention bleeding from the eyes, nose, and skin, symptoms that match no known form of plague at all, but resemble viral hemorrhagic fevers. It's now believed that multiple pathogens move together, each magnifying the other's reach. Malnutrition from decades of cold weather and famine made immune systems brittle. Crowded towns and refugee camps, born of hunger and fear, became incubators. In such conditions, even a mild infection could turn fatal. When several circulated at once, the result was catastrophe. Anthrax, for instance, thrives in livestock during wet then dry cycles, the kind Europe experienced after volcanic winters. Its spores can survive in soil for decades. Outbreaks among animals often preceded plague among people. And some descriptions of victims turning black almost instantly may point not to bubonic infection, but to anthrax sepsis. Meanwhile, influenza or another airborne virus could spread alongside, infecting those already weakened by bacterial disease. The combination, the syndemic, was more lethal than any single germ. Forensic science supports this darker picture. In several medieval mass graves, including those at East Smithfield in London and at Hereford in England, DNA sequencing has revealed traces of more than one pathogen. Alongside Yersinia pestis appear fragments of Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, and genetic markers consistent with viral agents. Each would have been deadly alone. Together, they were unstoppable. The term for this kind of convergence is syndemic. When multiple diseases interact with social and environmental stress to create devastation greater than the sum of their parts. Famine, displacement, and fear acted as catalysts. Malnourished bodies became breeding grounds. People too weak to flee shared cramped quarters where rats thrived. Even their desperate hygiene rituals, smoke, herbs, vinegar baths, sometimes worsened infection rather than preventing it. History offers other clues. In 1485, long after the Black Death's first wave, a new killer appeared in England. The sweating sickness. It struck suddenly. A healthy man in the morning could be dead by nightfall. Victims collapsed in pools of sweat, delirious, their hearts racing. No buboes, no rash, just exhaustion and death. It swept through England in waves until 1551, then vanished forever. Modern researchers suspect hantavirus, or perhaps an extinct pathogen. Its pattern, a sudden, intense, short-lived outbreak, suggests a disease that required precise conditions. Conditions perhaps shaped by climate and crowding. For medieval Europe, such mysteries were constant. To them, pestilence came and went like storms. To us, the pattern now seems clear. Volcanic eruptions dim the sun, cooling the earth. Cooling brought famine. Famine weakened the body. Weakness opened the door to plague, anthrax, influenza, and fevers beyond naming. The great die-offs of the 14th and 15th centuries were not random tragedies. They were the inevitable result of a world pushed beyond balance. Volcanic eruptions cooled the climate. Climate stress caused famines. Famines weakened populations. Weakened populations were vulnerable to disease. And disease caused something else. Something that terrified medieval people even more than death itself. Madness. In 1491, a convent of nuns in Holland began climbing trees and meowing like cats. For 3 months, the convent sounded like an animal shelter. The church sent exorcists. Modern science would have sent psychiatrists. Centuries later, in 1962, it happened again, half a world away. In the hills of Tanganyika, now Tanzania, laughter began in a girls' boarding school. It started with 3 students. Within hours, dozens were laughing uncontrollably. Within days, the entire school was overcome. Teachers dismissed the classes, thinking it would pass. It didn't. The laughter spread to neighboring villages, affecting hundreds, then thousands. People laughed until they wept, until their bodies shook, until exhaustion forced them to collapse. It lasted not days, but months. No toxin, no infection, no clear cause. Just laughter, contagious and unstoppable. Psychologists later called it mass psychogenic illness, where emotion becomes epidemic. The mind, under stress, finds release through the body, and others, seeing it, unconsciously follow. But this phenomenon was not born in the 20th century. It haunted Europe for centuries, long before science had a name for it. In the summer of 1374, in the German city of Aachen, witnesses saw something equally strange. Hundreds of people poured into the streets, dancing, laughing, and shouting in wild ecstasy. They leapt and spun until their feet bled, until their muscles failed. Some collapsed in the dirt, convulsing, still laughing. Chroniclers called it Saint Vitus's dance and believed the afflicted were cursed or possessed. Within weeks, the mania spread along the Rhine, through Cologne, Metz, and Strasbourg. Priests led processions, hoping prayer might calm the madness. Nothing worked. At the time, Europe was a cauldron of anxiety. The Black Death had only recently retreated. The economy had collapsed. Climate swings brought famine and fear. People lived with a constant sense of divine judgment. In that atmosphere of dread, emotion was tinder. One spark, a sermon, a superstition, a single scream could ignite hundreds of minds. Inside convent walls, the same fire found different fuel. Monasteries and nunneries were sealed worlds, governed by silence, prayer, and discipline. Many of those inside were children or teenagers, sent there against their will, trapped in cloistered routines. Their bodies may have been still, but their minds roiled beneath the surface. When one broke, laughing, barking, or meowing, the rest followed, not out of imitation, but contagion of emotion. In 1491, in a Dutch convent near Utrecht, nuns began to meow. It started with one. She claimed she felt a spirit inside her, forcing her to mimic the sound of cats. Others soon joined until the entire convent filled with the sounds of animals. They scratched, hissed, and climbed trees in the courtyard. The church sent priests to perform exorcisms. The nuns screamed when sprinkled with holy water, but the demons never left, only changed their shape. From meowing to laughter, from laughter to barking. Other accounts tell of nuns crawling on all fours, or convulsing together in perfect rhythm. In a French convent in 1749, the sisters began repeating words compulsively, unable to stop. In Germany, some nuns bit one another until blood flowed. To outsiders, it was proof of possession. To the women themselves, it was terror they couldn't explain. The same patterns appeared in monasteries, cities, schools, and towns. Wherever life was repressed and tightly ordered, outbreaks emerged. The laughter, the shaking, the mimicry, each was a language of distress. Those who lived under vows of silence could not speak rebellion aloud, so their bodies spoke for them. The mind, unable to bear its cage, found escape through contagion. Eyewitnesses wrote of the horror and fascination of it. Women laughing until they fainted. Whole convents trembling with nervous energy. Priests shouting prayers into chaos. What they saw looked supernatural. What they were witnessing was human. Stress and fear can ripple through a community like sound through air, changing form with every echo. The laughter, the animal sounds, the compulsive behaviors, all were manifestations of mass psychogenic illness. But why did these symptoms spread so rapidly? Why did entire communities catch what shouldn't be contagious? The answer lies in the most powerful force in the human brain: social connection. Your brain has specialized cells whose only job is to copy what others do. It's how babies learn. It's how culture forms. And in the right conditions, it's how madness spreads. These cells are called mirror neurons, tiny biological mirrors in the brain that fire not only when you perform an action, but when you watch someone else perform it. When you see another person smile, your mirror neurons activate the same pattern as if you were smiling yourself. When you see someone in pain, your body flinches, your heart races, your brain simulates their suffering. It's the architecture of empathy. and it's older than language. But empathy has a shadow side. The same mechanism that lets us understand others can make us absorb their fear, their stress, even their symptoms. This is the essence of a social contagion. The invisible transmission of emotion, behavior, and sensation through networks of human connection. You see it in harmless ways every day. A yawn travels silently through a room. Laughter multiplies in an audience until no one remembers what started it. Even moods spread. Studies show that happiness, anxiety, or anger can ripple through social networks like a virus. Each interaction subtly adjusting the chemistry of another person's brain. In medieval Europe, those networks were smaller but more intense. Convents, monasteries, and villages were enclosed worlds where people lived in constant proximity. When one person laughed uncontrollably, trembled, or cried, the others felt it in their bodies. Mirror neurons fired, emotions synchronized, and soon, the whole group shared the same physiological storm. No demon was needed. The contagion lived in the brain. Modern research has revealed just how powerful this mechanism is. In one experiment, scientists observed groups watching videos of people yawning. Even when the participants tried to resist, nearly half yawned anyway. Proof that the impulse bypasses conscious control. In another study, when people viewed facial expressions of fear or disgust, their own facial muscles twitched in the same pattern within milliseconds. The body imitates before the mind even registers what it sees. When stress and fear are added to that circuitry, the results can spiral. In schools, for example, a single student fainting can trigger waves of fainting through an entire classroom, even though no toxin or pathogen is found. It's not fakery. Their nervous systems are genuinely overwhelmed, copying the body's crisis signals of those around them. The more closed and anxious the environment, the stronger the contagion. That's why convents, ships, and boarding schools, places of tight hierarchy and emotional repression, were so often ground zero for outbreaks of dancing, laughing, or possessed behavior. The adolescent brain, in particular, is wired for mimicry. Teenagers' mirror neuron systems are hyperactive, tuned to read social cues with almost painful precision. It's how they learn belonging. But under stress, fear of punishment, isolation, or moral guilt, that same sensitivity becomes vulnerability. If one member of a peer group exhibits strange behavior, the rest unconsciously align. The group brain moves as one. Belief acts as a multiplier. If people expect an illness to spread, their brains become hypervigilant for its signs. A rumor of poisoning can make hundreds feel sick within hours. A whispered story of possession can make a convent howl with animal sounds by nightfall. The anticipation creates the symptom. The symptom confirms the belief, and the belief strengthens the contagion. It is a perfect feedback loop. Belief begetting experience. Experience feeding belief. Modern life has not escaped this mechanism. It has amplified it. The same mirror system that once linked small communities now operates at the scale of billions. Social media is an infinite hall of mirrors. One person's fear or outrage reflected endlessly, each reflection shaping behavior in the real world. The neural hardware is ancient. The network it now runs on is unprecedented. Our brains are not solitary machines. They are social organs designed to synchronize. Every smile, every shiver, and every shared moment of fear or Joy is a signal crossing the invisible bridge between minds. That bridge makes civilization possible, but it also makes hysteria inevitable. Social contagion explained how symptoms spread. But there was one symptom that seemed to defy even this explanation. One that plagued medieval Europe more than any other. The belief that tiny demons were crawling under your skin, eating you alive from the inside. They could feel them. Thousands of tiny things crawling under their skin, burrowing deeper. They would scratch until they bled, desperate to dig them out. But there was never anything there. In medieval Europe, physicians and priests recorded countless cases of people tormented by invisible creatures. Men claimed worms lived in their flesh. Women swore that insects laid eggs beneath their skin. Some believed that demons had entered their bodies, chewing slowly from the inside out. They clawed, scraped, burned themselves with candles, and begged for holy water to drive the invaders out. To their neighbors, they were cursed. To modern medicine, they were suffering from a condition we now call delusory parasitosis. The unshakable belief that one's body is infested with parasites. In the 13th and 14th centuries, these reports multiplied, often appearing after plagues or famines. Chroniclers described flesh worms, invisible fleas, and demonic insects. In one French town, an entire household was said to have been stricken. They washed constantly, tore their clothes apart searching for the culprits, and spread the fear to their servants. Soon, the servants began to itch too. No one could sleep. The local physician prescribed purgatives and bloodletting, certain that the body's imbalance was to blame. When that failed, the priest performed an exorcism. The family's suffering only deepened. To modern eyes, these cases reveal the perfect storm of biology and belief. The medieval world was crawling with actual parasites. Fleas, lice, mites, and intestinal worms were universal. People lived with constant itching, rashes, and sores. When someone felt the familiar sensation of crawling skin, but found no visible cause, it wasn't hard to imagine that invisible creatures, or worse, spirits, were at work. Their belief had a foundation in reality. And yet, many of these infestations were illusions born in the nervous system itself. Severe stress, malnutrition, and vitamin deficiencies can alter the way the brain interprets touch. A deficiency of vitamin B, common in famine-stricken populations surviving on grain alone, can cause formication, the eerie, unmistakable sensation of something crawling beneath the skin. When thousands across Europe were starving, sleep-deprived, and terrified of divine punishment, those phantom sensations must have seemed like proof of possession. What began as a private horror often became a public one. In several records, entire groups developed identical symptoms after hearing vivid descriptions from others. A merchant's wife in Milan spoke of the worms she could feel wriggling in her arms. Her servants listened, and soon they felt them too. The phenomenon spread through the neighborhood like rumor. Everyone convinced they were infected by the same invisible plague. The mind's mirror, that ancient empathy system, was once again at work. In their fear, their brains copied each other's pain. Treatment only deepened the torment. Physicians prescribed scalding baths, bleeding, and purging, all intended to cleanse the body. Some sufferers rubbed themselves with vinegar, sulfur, or holy oil, trying to burn away the unseen invaders. Others were confined to monasteries or executed for suspected witchcraft. A few, convinced that insects lived in their skulls, begged doctors to drill holes to let them out. Modern psychiatry understands delusory parasitosis as a complex interplay of body and mind. It can arise from neurological imbalance, psychological trauma, or lingering sensations after a genuine infection. The brain misfires, translating anxiety and nerve signals into physical certainty. And once that certainty takes root, it resists all logic. The sufferer doesn't imagine the feeling. It is real to them, a full sensory experience. The only illusion lies in its cold social contagion amplifies it. In tight communities under stress, like medieval villages or cloistered convents, the power of suggestion can turn one person's hallucination into many. The stories travel faster than disease. A neighbor speaks of crawling sensations. Another begins to itch, and before long, an epidemic of invisible worms consumes a town. To medieval minds, the explanation was obvious. Only demons or witchcraft could make people feel their own flesh betray them. Priests recorded hundreds of exorcisms for crawling devils. Physicians spoke of corrupted humors. What they never realized was that they were witnessing the collision of biology, belief, and terror. The human mind buckling under a world too cruel to endure. Invisible parasites, dancing plagues, laughing epidemics, all were the brain's response to unbearable stress. But medieval people faced something modern societies rarely experience. A world where safety didn't exist, where the next year might bring famine, plague, or war. The question isn't why these phenomena occurred. It's how anyone stayed sane at all. For 1,000 years, every generation of medieval Europeans believed they were living in the final days. Not metaphorically, literally. Next year, maybe next month, Christ would return and the world would end. Imagine living your entire life in that shadow. The Bible had promised it. The stars would fall, the seas would boil, the righteous would rise, and the wicked would burn. For the people of the Middle Ages, this wasn't myth. It was a calendar. Chroniclers marked every eclipse, every plague, every comet as a sign that prophecy was unfolding. The year 1000 loomed like a deadline. As it approached, monasteries recorded waves of fear. Peasants abandoned fields. Nobles donated fortunes to the church. Many confessed their sins and waited through the night of December 31st, 999, believing dawn would bring the trumpet of the Last Judgment. When the sun rose as usual, the relief was brief. Some said their prayers had delayed the apocalypse. Others insisted the clock of heaven had merely been reset. The sense of living on borrowed time never left. Every new disaster renewed the conviction that the world was unraveling. A comet streaking across the sky was not a celestial event. It was an omen, a fiery sword of God. Eclipses terrified entire kingdoms. Market closed, churches filled, and people knelt in the streets. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, killing half of Europe within a few years, it seemed like the final blow. Preachers filled pulpits with warnings that the horsemen of Revelation had come. Death, famine, war, and pestilence. What clearer signs could there be? Christian eschatology gave suffering a shape. Every famine, every flood fit neatly into the narrative of judgment and redemption. To suffer was to be tested. To die was to be purified. The Church understood the power of this story and used it to guide and control the faithful. Priests preached that generosity might shorten the world's torment. Donations rose. Fear became currency. Across Europe, mass movements arose in waves of desperation. Flagellant processions, thousands of men and women marching barefoot through towns, whipping themselves bloody, spread like wildfire. They believed that if they shared Christ's pain, they could cleanse humanity's sins and postpone the end. The air rang with the crack of lashes and the rhythm of hymns. In some places, the processions turned violent, attacking anyone they believed sinful. Jews, heretics, even clergy. In others, people sold everything they owned, convinced that earthly possessions were meaningless when the world was burning. Apocalyptic fear also produced its mirror image, a fierce, almost ecstatic faith. If the end was near, then every act mattered infinitely. People confessed their sins in public squares, wept to you together, and made pilgrimages barefoot across mountains. The fear of judgment could drive cruelty, but it could also create moments of genuine unity, a shared conviction that history itself was trembling. Psychologically, to live in constant expectation of the end reshaped the medieval mind. It fostered fatalism. Why plan for the future if there might be none? But also frenzy. People lived in extremes, torn between penitence and indulgence. Some withdrew into monasteries. Others danced in the streets until they collapsed, believing joy itself could ward off despair. Apocalyptic belief was the emotional climate of the age. It was the backdrop against which every disaster, every miracle, every strange behavior made sense. When the world feels doomed, madness becomes logic. Dancing until death, seeing demons under your skin, whipping yourself in the square, all became acts of survival in a reality that seemed one step from ending. Apocalyptic belief was reinforced by a world that genuinely seemed to be ending. Because every few decades, something catastrophic did happen. Plague, famine, invasion, climate disaster. Medieval people weren't irrational to fear the end. Their world really was ending, over and over again. Between the years 1300 and 1450, a person born in Europe had a 30% chance of dying in a famine, a 50% chance of experiencing plague, and a near certainty of witnessing war. Catastrophe wasn't exceptional, it was normal. The Middle Ages were not an age of darkness in the romantic sense, but in the literal one, an age repeatedly shadowed by death. To be alive then was to live inside a revolving door of disaster. Every few decades, the world cracked open again. The Viking invasions of the 8th to 11th centuries were the first great wave, a century of fire and terror rolling through coastal Europe. Monasteries burned, villages vanished, and survivors fled inland, clutching relics. Just as that storm quieted, new ones rose. The Norman conquest of 1066 reshaped England in blood and ash. Entire towns were emptied to make room for fortresses. By the next century, the First Crusade had begun. Thousands marching east to reclaim Jerusalem, leaving behind famine and plague in their wake. Even victories came laced with ruin. Europe stumbled from one upheaval to another, and each one left deeper scars. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 struck after years of erratic weather. Torrential rain drowned the fields, grain rotted in storage. Across France, England, and the Low Countries, people ate bark, dogs, and the flesh of the dead. Chroniclers wrote of children abandoned by starving parents, of villages so silent that grass grew in the streets. One famine generation grew into another. their bodies small, their bones etched with malnutrition. Barely a generation later, plague arrived. Between 1347 and 1351, half of Europe vanished. Families died together in single nights. Towns lost their entire populations. The world shrank, and the survivors lived surrounded by ghosts. The plague returned again and again for centuries, like a tide that never truly receded. No one ever felt safe. War filled the gaps between pestilence. The 100 Years' War, 1337–1453, turned the soil of France into a graveyard. Cities were besieged, villages burned, fields salted. Armies spread disease as easily as they spread terror. In its 100th year, the war's survivors had lived their entire lives under the sound of marching boots and burning roofs. Smaller disasters swarmed between the larger ones. Local famines, crop failures, and outbreaks of ergot poisoning or typhus were so common that chroniclers barely recorded them. To them, disaster wasn't news. It was the weather. On average, a medieval European could expect at least one major catastrophe in their lifetime, often more. The result was a continent perpetually rebuilding itself, never finishing before the next collapse began. This rhythm of destruction created what modern psychologists call generational trauma. Populations never fully recovered before the next crisis struck. Infrastructure decayed faster than it could be restored. Food stores were depleted, and birth rates lagged behind death. The collective memory of hunger, plague, and fear lived on in stories, rituals, and the body itself. Children were born into anxiety inherited from their parents, a cultural memory of apocalypse that shaped their worldview. Under such strain, the human mind reaches for meaning. The cycle of catastrophe reinforced the belief that these events must be willed by God, the devil, or human sin. When suffering becomes constant, randomness feels unbearable. The supernatural offers order, even if it's cruel. Preachers thundered about divine punishment. Villagers blamed witches, foreigners, or heretics. Fear sought faces to accuse. Chronic stress changes how people think. Studies show that prolonged insecurity makes the brain favor quick, emotional reasoning over logic. It narrows focus to threats, deepens belief in authority, and heightens superstition. In a medieval world where every year might bring a new horror, fear was a survival strategy. But it also fragmented society, turning neighbor against neighbor, faith into fanaticism. And yet, in that endless night, something else persisted: endurance. People rebuilt, re-sowed, re-prayed. They danced, they sang, they tried again. The cycle of catastrophe forged both cruelty and compassion, madness and resilience, the extremes of the human condition drawn out by unrelenting crisis. Constant catastrophe should have destroyed medieval society. And in some ways, it did. Entire regions depopulated, cultural knowledge was lost, and life expectancy plummeted. But somehow, something in the human spirit refused to break. And that refusal created both the worst and best of medieval behavior. Medieval Europe was a nightmare. But in that nightmare, people fell in love, raised children, told jokes, created art, and built communities that supported each other through unimaginable horror. The same species that burned witches also built hospitals to care for lepers. It's easy to see the Middle Ages as an age of fear, 1,000 years of plague, famine, and superstition. Yet, beneath that darkness, ran something luminous: resilience. The same pressure that fractured minds also forged strength. Every disaster that struck Europe forced its people to invent new ways to endure. When the Black Death first tore through towns, the initial reaction was chaos. Families abandoned each other, priests fled, and commerce collapsed. But as the waves of plague returned, societies adapted. Cities established the first public health boards. Venice created quarantine islands, lazaretti, where arriving ships waited before docking. Florence began keeping death registers, early versions of epidemiological records. In England, the Statute of Labourers was passed to manage post-plague labour shortages, a law that indirectly reshaped the entire economy. Out of terror came administration, foresight, and the faint outline of public health. Communities, too, began building safety nets. Guilds, the powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants, did more than regulate trade. They cared for the sick, buried the dead, and supported widows and orphans. If a member fell ill, others stepped in. If his family starved, they were fed. The guild was both workplace and welfare system, a structure born from necessity. In towns and villages, brotherhoods and confraternities arose. Voluntary groups devoted to charity and mutual aid. Out of shared fear grew shared responsibility. The cycle of catastrophe also drove innovation in unexpected places. Constant risk made people think collectively about survival. Banking, insurance, and record-keeping systems evolved to manage uncertainty. Merchants began pooling resources to spread financial risk. Churches built hospitals, not just for the dying, but for the living poor. In many cities, the sick and destitute were given care at a time when even medicine itself barely existed. Some of those hospitals still stand. Modern psychology calls this phenomenon post-traumatic growth. The idea that suffering can lead to strength. Trauma breaks, but it also transforms. People who survive catastrophe often report a deeper sense of empathy, purpose, and connection. The same seems true of medieval society. Out of endless loss came compassion. Chroniclers tell of citizens in plague-stricken Florence as forming groups to bring food to the quarantined, knowing they might die in the process. Monks in German abbeys tended to lepers, calling them living images of Christ. In a world that seemed abandoned by God, many people chose to become God's mercy themselves. Even humor survived. Medieval manuscripts are full of marginal doodles, tiny rabbits jousting, monks playing dice, faces grimacing at the margins of sacred text. The jokes are centuries old, yet instantly human. They prove that laughter persisted, that even in times of horror, people still found absurdity and joy. Art, too, flourished amid disaster. After the Black Death, the macabre became common in paintings and carvings, not as nihilism, but as acceptance. Skeletons dance with the nobles and peasants alike in the Danse Macabre, reminding viewers that death was universal, but life still had meaning. Cathedrals continued to rise, their stained glass windows glowing like frozen sunlight. In the act of building beauty, while surrounded by decay, medieval people defied despair. Religion gave them a framework to endure what reason could not explain. To modern eyes, their beliefs may seem delusional, interpreting famine as divine wrath, plague as punishment. But those narratives gave suffering purpose. To believe pain meant purification was to make pain bearable. Their faith turned chaos into story, and story into strength. Resilience was not denial. It was adaptation, learned over centuries of loss. Each generation inherited not just trauma, but the tools to survive it. They developed rituals for mourning, systems for aid, and a kind of stoic acceptance that catastrophe was not the end, but part of existence itself. The Middle Ages remind us that resilience and cruelty are twins born of the same conditions. The fear that burned witches also built hospitals. The despair that spawned flagellants also inspired reformers. In every age of collapse, humanity reveals both its darkness and its endurance. Medieval people survived their nightmares, but they left behind a legacy, not just of strange phenomena, but of questions about human nature. Because every phenomenon we've explored reveals something about what humans do when stressed, frightened, and struggling to understand their world. And those patterns haven't disappeared. They've just changed form. In 2011, in a small American town, teenage girls began having seizures. Doctors found no medical cause. The media called it a mystery. Historians called it familiar. They'd seen it before, in 1518. Leroy, New York, was an ordinary town. Quiet streets, a single high school, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Then one winter morning, a student collapsed in class. Her arms jerked uncontrollably. Within days, more girls followed, twitching, shouting involuntarily, unable to stop sudden spasms and tics. By month's end, the number had grown to nearly 20. Parents panicked. News crews descended. Rumors of toxins, vaccines, and environmental poisoning flooded the internet. But blood tests, air samples, and soil studies revealed nothing. No infection. No contamination. Just symptoms spreading. Eventually, neurologists reached a conclusion no one wanted to hear. Mass psychogenic illness. The girls weren't faking, and they weren't crazy. Their symptoms were real, their suffering genuine, but their brains were manifesting stress through the body. Like the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages, the illness spread through observation, empathy, and fear. Once the media frenzy subsided and the girls received psychological support, the outbreak faded. It was a modern echo of an ancient pattern. 500 years earlier in Strasbourg in 1518, townspeople had filled the streets, convulsing and dancing until they collapsed. The social ingredients were the same. Young people, intense pressure, a closed environment, an invisible stress with no outlet. When one body breaks, others follow. Leroy wasn't unique. In 1983, in the West Bank, hundreds of Palestinian schoolgirls fainted over several weeks. The cause was never identified. Investigators found no toxins, no gas leaks, no infection, only fear. The region was under occupation, tensions were high, and the girls lived under constant stress. Their bodies became vessels for collective anxiety. As with the medieval nuns who meowed and laughed uncontrollably, the symptom became the message. In the 1970s, Singapore's factories experienced a series of fainting epidemics among female workers. Supervisors initially blamed poor ventilation, but the episodes always followed moments of extreme stress. A shouted reprimand, a missed quota, a co-worker collapsing nearby. In many cases, the fainting spread through entire workshops within minutes. When government officials brought in doctors, and religious leaders to bless the factories and reassure the workers, the epidemics stopped. Fear, belief, and physiology had tangled into one. Even today, the same mechanism plays out online. On social media platforms like TikTok, doctors have noticed sudden global spikes in specific tics, stutters, and involuntary movements, symptoms mimicking those of Tourette's syndrome. Many of the affected users were young women who had spent hours watching videos of others with similar tics. Their brains, wired for empathy and imitation, mirrored what they saw until the behavior became real. Once again, mirror neurons carried contagion, and stress found a new language through the body. Mass psychogenic illness remains deeply misunderstood. The name itself sounds dismissive, as if it means imaginary. But brain imaging tells a different story. In those afflicted areas of the brain that process pain, movement, and emotion light up as if real injury or infection were present. The body reacts to imagined threat as though it were physical, releasing adrenaline, tightening muscles, altering blood flow. The suffering is authentic, the cause invisible. The parallels to the medieval world are almost eerie. In both, outbreaks strike tight social groups, schools, convents, factories, where stress is high and emotional expression is limited. In both, the illness is amplified by authority and attention. Priests then, media now. And in both, the epidemics eventually fade when the social pressure is released, when fear loses its voice. The differences are superficial. Electricity instead of candles, smartphones instead of sermons. The human nervous system hasn't changed. It still carries the same ancient circuitry, ready to echo the emotions of those around it, to transform collective stress into collective symptoms. The modern world has new names for it: conversion disorder, functional neurological syndrome. But the dance is the same. Dancing plagues evolved into modern mass psychogenic illness. But what about witch hunts? Those surely are artifacts of medieval ignorance, impossible in our scientific age. Except they never stopped. They just changed who the witches were. In the 1980s, thousands of Americans believed that a secret network of satanic cults was hiding in plain sight, lurking behind daycares, churches, and quiet suburban homes. The fear spread like wildfire. Whispered stories of the midnight rituals, children sacrificed in basements, and symbols carved into hidden rooms. Police departments formed special occult units. Parents checked their children for signs of unseen abuse. Dozens of ordinary people were accused, arrested, and imprisoned for crimes that, as it turned out, never happened. The medieval witch hunt had returned, only the language had changed. It began with a single spark, a new kind of therapy, promising to unlock repressed memories. Patients, guided by suggestion and expectation, began recalling impossible scenes of ritual torment. Investigators, swept up in horror, took every word as truth. Media reports fueled the flames, each headline amplifying the panic. By the time skepticism arrived, lives had already been destroyed. Families were shattered, reputations erased. The satanic panic of the 1980s would later be remembered as one of the darkest psychological contagions in modern America, where imagination became evidence and fear replaced reason. One of the most infamous cases was the McMartin preschool trial in California. It began when a single parent made an accusation against a teacher. Soon, hundreds of children were interviewed by well-meaning psychologists. But the interviews weren't neutral. They were filled with leading questions, rewards for remembering certain details, and subtle pressure to please adults. The stories that emerged grew fantastical. Teachers flying through the air, underground tunnels beneath the playground, rituals in secret chambers. When investigators later excavated the grounds, they found nothing. No tunnels, no evidence. Yet the trial dragged on for 7 years and became the longest and most expensive criminal case in US history. All defendants were acquitted, but their lives never recovered. What happened wasn't unique. Throughout history, collective fears have always sought tangible villains. In medieval Europe, it was witches consorting with the devil. In the 1980s, it was daycare workers accused of satanic rituals. In each case, the symptoms spread through small, tight communities, villages, schools, churches, where anxiety could ripple unchecked. Authority figures, convinced they were saving the innocent, became agents of destruction. And behind every moral panic lay the same human instinct: to impose order on chaos by finding someone to blame. The pattern didn't end with the 20th century. It only adapted. In the 1990s, heavy metal bands and violent video games were accused of corrupting youth. Politicians demanded bans, preachers warned of moral collapse, and parents searched for hidden messages in song lyrics. Later, social media would amplify these cycles into a new kind of witch hunt. One conducted not in courtrooms but on screens. A single accusation, a rumor, a viral clip taken out of context could destroy a person overnight. The flames of outrage move faster now. But the essence is the same: fear dressed as virtue, certainty without evidence. To be clear, not all public outrage is unjust. Real accountability matters. Harm does occur. But beneath many modern crusades lies a familiar hunger for purity, a desire to draw a clear line between the righteous and the damned. It feels comforting to believe that evil can be isolated in a few individuals, rather than recognized as part of a system, or worse, a part of ourselves. When complex problems, economic change, social anxiety, cultural loss, feel too large to face, or we still reach for the simplest narrative, someone must be responsible. Today's scapegoats shift with the tides. Immigrants accused of taking jobs, religious minorities accused of eroding tradition, groups painted as threats to moral order or social stability. The names change, but the emotional rhythm remains identical to the witch trials of centuries past. Panic, accusation, confession, punishment, silence. Modern forensic psychology has learned painful lessons from these histories. Interviewing techniques now guard against suggestion. Evidence must pass stricter tests. Yet the deeper current, the psychological need to find villains in the fog, still moves beneath the surface. Technology didn't cure it. It only gave it a faster heartbeat. We still hunt witches. We still experience dancing plagues. But there's one medieval phenomenon that seems truly impossible in modern times. Surely, in our age of instant global communication and scientific literacy, we couldn't have mass delusions about physical phenomena. Except we do, constantly. We laugh at medieval people for believing in curses and demonic possession. We imagine ourselves as rational beings, illuminated by science and reason. Yet, across the modern world, millions sincerely believe that invisible waves from Wi-Fi routers or cell towers are making them ill. They report headaches, nausea, dizziness, symptoms that feel absolutely real. But when scientists test these claims under controlled conditions, the pattern breaks apart. The symptoms appear whether or not any electromagnetic fields are present. What they've discovered is not fakery, but expectation-shaping experience, the body responding to belief. Same brain, different century. This phenomenon, called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, has echoes of older fears, unseen forces that torment the innocent, mysterious energies that slip through walls. In the Middle Ages, such sensations might have been blamed on a curse or a demonic presence. Today, they're blamed on technology. The story has changed, but the structure is identical. A search for meaning in sensations that science can't yet explain in personal terms. And just as priests once tried to exorcise invisible demons, modern believers wrap their homes in foil or flee into remote white zones, chasing relief from an enemy that exists mostly in the mind. The same pattern surfaced in what became known as the Havana Syndrome. Beginning in 2016, American diplomats in Cuba began reporting strange noises, followed by dizziness, memory loss, and intense headaches. Some suspected a secret sonic weapon. Governments launched investigations, scientists debated, and the public imagination filled the gaps. Years later, the leading hypothesis emerged. A mass psychogenic illness, real symptoms, but no physical cause. The mind, primed by fear and expectation, had turned anxiety into physical experience. Once again, invisible forces were blamed, and the story spread faster than any virus. Fear has always been contagious. In villages, people caught it through gossip and sermons. Today, we catch it through screens. When stories about danger echo across social media, each repetition sharpens belief. Wind turbine syndrome followed this path. In towns near new wind farms, residents began reporting insomnia, nausea, and anxiety. Studies showed the same pattern again and again. Symptoms were most common where fear had already taken hold through local rumors or online forums. When people were told turbines were dangerous, their bodies agreed. When they weren't told, the same machines caused no harm. From vaccines to GMOs to 5G towers, our age is thick with these invisible anxieties. Each new technology becomes the next suspect, the next mysterious force said to corrupt the body or mind. But behind every modern myth lies a simple psychological truth. Humans crave explanation. Random suffering feels intolerable. We'd rather believe in a malevolent cause than in meaningless coincidence. Medieval villagers blamed witches when their crops failed. Today we might blame chemicals, waves, or corporate conspiracies. Both instincts arise from the same place. The desperate need for a narrative that restores a sense of control. Science gives us tools to test our stories, but emotion still decides which stories we keep. Confirmation bias pushes us to seek evidence that supports what we already believe. The availability heuristic makes vivid, frightening examples feel more true than dull statistics. And once belief becomes part of our identity, part of who we are or the group we belong to, evidence itself begins to feel like an attack. It's not that people refuse truth, it's that truth threatens belonging. And belonging is older, deeper, more primal than logic. Researchers have found that misinformation spreads 6 times faster than corrections. Falsehoods are simpler, more emotional, more shareable. A single dramatic lie can circle the world before a careful truth finishes its first paragraph. The same dynamic that once carried rumors of witchcraft now carries viral conspiracies through algorithms and timelines. It's tempting to see ourselves as beyond superstition, but the truth is humbling. We are not fundamentally different from those who danced until collapse or pointed trembling fingers at supposed witches. We have the same brains, tuned for patterns, primed for fear. The difference is not in our nature, but in our choices. We can still chase illusions, or we can learn to question them. We are medieval, not in our technology, not in our knowledge, but in our minds, our psychology, our vulnerability to fear and confusion. Every phenomenon we've explored, dancing plagues, witch hunts, mass delusions, still happens. But there's a difference now. We can choose to learn from history instead of repeating it. If we're brave enough, after exploring 10 strange medieval phenomena, dancing plagues, bleeding statues, witch trials, miraculous visions, and illusions reborn in modern times, 3 truths emerge. Not about the Middle Ages, but about us. About what it means to be human when fear, uncertainty, and meaninglessness press against the edges of reason. And these truths are not comforting. Truth 1. The human brain under stress creates reality. When the world becomes unbearable, the mind does not passively record events. It edits, rewrites, and invents. Every dancing plague, every mass vision, every whispered accusation began with brains under siege. The brain's job is to protect us, to construct a version of the world that keeps us alive. But under stress, the same system that saves us can deceive us completely. A starving villager's trembling body becomes a vessel for divine frenzy. A terrified diplomat's dizziness becomes evidence of an invisible weapon. None of it is imagined in the dismissive sense. To the people experiencing it, it is real. Pain, exhaustion, panic, they twist perception until the impossible feels inevitable. This isn't stupidity or weakness, it's survival. Our ancestors didn't evolve to perceive truth, they evolved to perceive threats. And when the threat is invisible or uncertain, the brain fills the void with whatever pattern fits best. That's why collective fears spread faster than reason. Why a rumor can make people sick. Why invisible dangers, from witchcraft to radiation to sound weapons, can seize entire communities. The line between perception and hallucination, between belief and biology, is far thinner than we like to admit. Truth 2. Suffering seeks explanation. No one can endure chaos without a story. The plague, the famine, the inexplicable illness, none of it made sense to medieval minds until meaning was attached. Sin, demons, divine punishment. The world became bearable again when pain had a reason. The same instinct drives us now. When economies crash, when illness spreads, when violence erupts, we search for villains or patterns. Anything but randomness. This drive to explain suffering is deeply human and deeply dangerous. It comforts us even as it misleads us. Medieval Europe found solace in blaming witches. Modern societies find it in blaming governments, outsiders, or shadowy cabals. The content changes, the form remains. Meaning is the balm for pain, and when truth refuses to cooperate, we manufacture meaning instead. Yet this is also how art, science, and faith are born. The same need that fuels superstition also fuels discovery. The difference lies in whether we stop asking questions once a comforting answer appears. To understand medieval belief is to see our reflection in older glass. The urge to make sense of suffering is what binds centuries together. It's what makes the miraculous statue bleed, what gives the rumor its power, what allows fear to masquerade as insight. Truth 3. We are social before we are rational. Rules every story we've traced, from collective dancing to digital witch hunts, reveals the same foundation. We don't believe alone. We believe together. The human brain was built for belonging long before it was built for logic. A lone mind questioning the group was, in evolutionary terms, a dangerous thing to be. Survival required harmony, not accuracy. So when a belief spreads through a crowd, it feels safer to share it than to doubt it. Our nervous systems echo the emotions around us. We mirror gestures, fears, and faiths. That's how one person's trembling can become an epidemic. In medieval villages, the church bell could summon hundreds to witness a miracle. In today's digital square, a viral post does the same. We see what others see, we feel what others feel, and together we build a collective reality that can ignore any amount of evidence. That's not failure, it's design. But the instincts that once kept tribes alive can now turn entire nations inward, dividing truth into factions of belonging. These 3 truths explain not only medieval madness, but modern confusion. Our brains create reality under stress. Our suffering demands explanation, and our need to belong outweighs our need to be right. None of these traits are flaws. They're the blueprint of survival, written into the folds of every human mind. But they also mean that civilization's progress will always be haunted by its past. These 3 truths explain the past, but they also predict the future. Because if medieval phenomena still happen in modern forms, and if our brains haven't changed, then we can predict what will happen next time society faces extreme stress. And that prediction is alarming. The next dancing plague won't look like dancing. It might look like millions quietly stepping away from their jobs, convinced life no longer has meaning. It might look like synchronized despair spreading through social media feeds, or a conspiracy theory so vast it swallows half the planet's attention. The platforms will be digital, the choreography invisible, but the rhythm will be familiar. When collective stress overwhelms collective reason, the body of society begins to twitch. Every medieval outbreak began the same way: scarcity, fear, and exhaustion. The harvest failed, the plague returned, the saints seemed silent. Under enough pressure, the mind turned inward and made its own explanations, its own rituals. Our world is edging toward a similar pressure point. The climate crisis mirrors the medieval famine. A slow disaster that erodes trust, stability, and certainty about the future. As floods, fires, and storms increase, people begin to feel cornered by forces they can't control. That's the perfect soil for superstition to bloom again, just with new vocabulary. Weather manipulation, secret technologies, divine punishment by another name. Pandemics still summon the same ancient patterns. During COVID-19, fear spread faster than the virus itself. Conspiracy theories multiplied, scapegoats appeared, and false cures circulated like relics of faith. Some isolated communities even experienced outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness, groups fainting, trembling, or developing shared symptoms with no biological cause shared. The medieval witch trials began from that same fusion of stress and contagion, one person's suffering mirrored by many. The difference today is speed. In the time it once took rumors to travel from village to village, a digital whisper can reach continents. Information overload is our modern plague. In medieval times, people depended on priests or town criers to interpret the world. Now, billions interpret it simultaneously. The result isn't clarity, it's chaos. Each feed, each algorithmic echo chamber becomes a miniature cult of consensus, reinforcing its own version of truth. When fear enters that system, it spreads exponentially. The dancing plagues of the future may unfold entirely online. Mass belief movements, collective anxiety attacks, or digital purges that ripple through society. Economic instability will add fuel. Just as medieval peasants blamed witches when prices soared and crops failed, modern citizens look for villains when markets collapse. When jobs vanish to automation or war, the same instinct emerges. Someone must be responsible. Anger seeks targets, rumors offer them. The scapegoat changes shape, from heretics to foreigners to political opponents. But the logic remains constant. Purity through exclusion, security through blame. At the same time, our social fabric is thinner than ever. Medieval villagers lived inside tight webs of obligation and ritual. Today, millions move through life half-connected, more networked, less rooted. Loneliness is epidemic, and isolation magnifies stress, makes minds more suggestible, more hungry for belonging. When a collective delusion offers that belonging, people join gladly. What began as anxiety becomes a movement, a mission, a moral crusade. Yet there is reason for hope. The same technology that spreads panic can spread perspective. Modern psychology understands the mechanics of mass delusion. Neuroscience can map how fear distorts perception. History itself serves as a warning label for the human mind. We know now that stress is the catalyst, that rumor is the vector, that connection, real, grounded connection, is the antidote. When communities communicate openly, when institutions respond with empathy instead of denial, outbreaks of hysteria fade. Recognizing these patterns gives us a choice that medieval people never had. We can notice the early signs, the sharp rise in rumor, the sudden polarization, the feeling that everyone's reality is fracturing. Instead of punishment, we can offer calm. Instead of accusation, understanding. The next dancing plague doesn't have to consume us. It can become the moment we finally learn to read our own minds as carefully as we read our machinines. Predicting the next crisis is alarming, but it's also empowering, because if we know the pattern, we can break it. Medieval people couldn't. They lacked the scientific knowledge, the historical perspective, and the psychological tools. We have all three. The question is whether we'll use them. Medieval people danced until they died, burned thousands of innocents, and lived in a fog of terror, not because they were foolish, but because they didn't know better. They had no microscope to see the invisible, no psychology to explain the mind, no history to reveal recurring patterns. Their world was a maze without a map. Ours isn't. We have the map. The question is whether we'll use it. What separates us from the people who filled the streets of Strasbourg, or the ones who saw witches in every misfortune, is not intelligence. It's tools. The scientific method lets us test belief against evidence instead of instinct. Psychology helps us recognize when minds under pressure start distorting reality. History gives us warnings written in blood and rumor. Global communication allows any of us to challenge falsehood in real time. These are luxuries unimaginable to our ancestors, but they only matter if we use them deliberately, not just passively. Knowledge doesn't save us automatically. It saves us when we practice using it. Scientific literacy is one of our best defenses. When we understand how evidence is gathered, we become less vulnerable to emotional certainty. Critical thinking isn't about cynicism. It's about curiosity tempered by discipline. It means asking, what else could be true? It means tolerating uncertainty instead of rushing to comforting conclusions. In a crisis, that pause is everything. A single moment of reflection, multiplied across millions of minds, can slow a wave of hysteria before it crests. But logic alone isn't enough. We are still social creatures, wired for belonging. If fear is contagious, so is calm. That's why community matters. Strong connected networks, families, neighborhoods, workplaces, online spaces, rooted in empathy, act as buffers against mass delusion. When people feel seen and supported, they're less likely to fall into panic. When trust exists, rumor starves. When institutions are transparent and compassionate, conspiracy loses oxygen. Building resilient communities is not abstract philosophy. It's preventive medicine for the mind. On an individual level, we each hold more power than we realize. Every time we check a source before sharing, every time we resist the pull of outrage, every time we ask for evidence instead of accusation, we push back against the forces that once burned witches. It's not heroic, it's habit. Over time, those habits become culture. A culture that values evidence over impulse doesn't eliminate fear, but it prevents fear from steering the ship. Resilience is another form of knowledge. Medieval people had no concept of stress psychology, no tools for calming a nervous system hijacked by fear. We do. We know that rest, connection, and mindful awareness can stabilize the mind when the world feels chaotic. We can teach those skills widely, just as we teach literacy. We can train ourselves and our children to recognize the signs of mass psychogenic illness, the spreading of symptoms, the surge of certainty, the intoxicating pull of shared belief, and intervene early with compassion instead of scorn. Of course, none of this is easy. Questioning your own group's beliefs feels like betrayal. Admitting you might be wrong feels like weakness. Holding steady while everyone else panics feels unbearable. But difficulty doesn't make it impossible. It makes it meaningful. Progress has never been the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it. The same brain that once trembled before statues that bled can now design vaccines, satellites, and systems for global cooperation. The architecture of the mind hasn't changed, but our understanding of it has. The future will test that understanding. Climate instability, pandemics, economic shocks, digital manipulation, each will strain the human psyche in familiar ways. Our instincts will flare, to blame, to fear, to divide. That's inevitable. What's not inevitable is what happens next. We can choose to see those instincts for what they are, echoes of the medieval past rising within modern skin. And in that recognition lies freedom. Every dancing plague, every witch hunt, every mass delusion we've studied carried the same hidden message. Knowledge is not immunity, but awareness is power. We can see the pattern forming before it consumes us. We can speak softly when panic shouts. We can rebuild community where isolation grows. We can act with compassion even when fear tells us not to. That is the choice medieval people never had. History doesn't have to repeat. It only does when we forget that it's already happened. The medieval world left us a mirror, and in it we can see both our reflection and our potential. We will face new crises. Our brains will respond in ancient ways. But this time, we can recognize the dance before it begins and choose to step away.